Some things in the wilderness don't stay where you leave them. The Graves Creek Trail sits in the southeastern corner of Olympic National Park, a dense corridor of old-growth forest that climbs steadily from the Quinault River Valley toward the spine of the Olympic Range. It's a 16-mile route used primarily by backpackers heading deeper into the backcountry, and for most of the year, it sees fewer than a dozen hikers per week. The trail was established in 1938 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, cutting through stands of western hemlock and Douglas fir that were already centuries old when the first loggers arrived. The area has always been remote. Cell service ends 5 miles from the trailhead. Radio communication is spotty at best. In the spring of 2009, a surveyor named Marcus Delaney was contracted by the National Park Service to update trail markers and assess erosion along the upper sections of Graves Creek. Delaney had worked in the park for 11 years and knew the terrain well. On April 19th, while marking a GPS waypoint near mile marker 9, he noticed something unusual: a stone cairn, roughly 3 feet tall, sitting just off the trail on a flat stretch of granite outcrop. Cairns aren't uncommon in wilderness areas. Hikers build them as route markers or memorials, but this one felt deliberate. The stones were stacked with precision, each one roughly the same size, and the structure was stable, despite sitting on a sloped surface. Delaney photographed it, noted the GPS coordinates, and continued his survey. He returned to the same spot 6 days later to install a new trail sign. The cairn was gone, not collapsed gone. He checked his notes. The coordinates were correct. The outcrop was unmistakable. But there was no trace of disturbed ground, no scattered stones, nothing to suggest the cairn had ever been there. 3 days after that, another hiker, a woman named Stephanie Ruiz from Tacoma, submitted a photo to the park's visitor feedback page. The image showed a stone cairn identical to the one Delaney had documented. Same height, same tight stacking, but the location was different. According to the metadata embedded in the photo, it had been taken near mile marker 10, roughly 800 feet higher in elevation, and over a quarter-mile farther up the trail. Delaney requested the photo from park administration and compared it to his own. The stones looked identical gray basalt, with flecks of mica, weathered smooth. He couldn't be certain, but the similarity was striking. He filed a brief report noting the coincidence and moved on. He had no reason to think about it again, until it happened 4 more times. Between May of 2009 and August of 2010, 6 different hikers submitted photographs of stone cairns along the Graves Creek Trail. All of them appeared identical. All of them were located progressively higher along the ridgeline, and all of them, when revisited days or weeks later, had vanished. The Park Service began keeping a file. Delaney was asked to investigate further. He hiked the trail twice in September of 2010, dismantling 2 cairns he found at mile markers 11 and 12. He counted the stones in each, 47. Exactly. He returned 1 week later. Both cairns had been rebuilt. Same locations, same number of stones. By 2011, word had spread quietly among the hiking community. People began watching for the cairns, documenting them, trying to catch whoever was building them, but no one ever saw it happen. A medical researcher from Seattle named Dr. Anjali Mehta set up a motion-activated trail camera near mile marker 13 in July of 2011 after spotting a cairn there during a solo backpacking trip. She left the camera in place for 9 days. When she retrieved it, the cairn had moved it, now sat 200 feet higher, near a steep switchback she hadn't yet reached on her initial hike. The camera had captured over 400 images. None showed anyone building or moving stones. Deer, a black bear, rain, but no people. I went through every frame twice, Mehta said in an email to the Park Service. There's nothing. It's like the stones just walked up the hill on their own. A ranger named Colin Voss began his own investigation in 2012. Voss had been stationed at the Graves Creek Ranger Cabin for 3 seasons and had heard the stories from other staff. He was skeptical. He assumed it was a prank, maybe a group of hikers working together, moving the stones at night, trying to build a legend. In June, he carried a can of bright orange surveyor's paint up to mile marker 14 and marked each of the 47 stones in a cairn he found there. Small dots, barely visible unless you were looking for them. He photographed every stone individually. Then he dismantled the cairn completely and scattered the stones into the forest, some as far as 50 feet from the trail. 11 days later, the cairn was back. Same location, same configuration. And when Voss examined it closely, he found his orange marks on every single stone. He didn't file an official report, but he mentioned it to a journalist named Todd Griffith, who was writing a feature on unusual park phenomena for a regional outdoor magazine. Griffith interviewed Voss off the record. He seemed genuinely rattled, Griffith later said in a phone interview. This was a guy who'd worked in remote wilderness for 15 years. He'd seen a lot, but he kept saying the same thing. It doesn't make sense. No one could have found all those stones. I threw some of them into a ravine. The Park Service declined to comment publicly, but internal memos from 2012 and 2013 show growing concern. A memo dated October 5, 2012, references a consultation with a geologist from the University of Washington who suggested the movement could be caused by freeze-thaw cycles shifting the stones uphill, a process known as frost heave. But frost heave is slow, chaotic, and doesn't create organized structures. It certainly doesn't rebuild cairns in identical configurations. Another memo, dated March 2013, mentions a request to close the upper sections of the Graves Creek Trail for erosion mitigation. The closure never happened, but the memos stopped. So did the official documentation. By 2014, reports of the cairns had slowed. A few hikers still mentioned seeing them, but the Park Service no longer responded to inquiries. Delaney, the original surveyor, left his position with the park in late 2013. He declined to be interviewed for this account. Voss transferred to a different district. Meta's trail camera was never retrieved. She reported it missing in August of 2014, though she couldn't recall the exact location where she'd placed it. The last documented sighting came from a college student named Brian Wolf, who posted a photo to a hiking forum in September of 2014. The cairn in his image sat near mile marker 15, just below the ridgeline where the trail begins its descent toward the Enchanted Valley. He noted in his post that the stones looked weathered, as if they'd been there for years, but the stack was tight, deliberate. And when another user asked if he'd counted the stones, he replied, 47. I thought that was weird, so I counted twice. No one has reported seeing the cairn since. The trail remains open. Hikers still pass through. But if you search the Park Service's public database for information on the Graves Creek cairns, you'll find nothing. The internal memos have been archived, and the case was never officially closed. It simply stopped being a case. Delaney still lives in Washington. He didn't respond to requests for comment, but a former colleague mentioned that he no longer hikes in Olympic National Park. Voss retired in 2018. Meta moved to Boston. Griffith's article was never published. The magazine folded before it could run. And somewhere along the Graves Creek Trail, on a stretch of granite between the forest and the sky, 47 stones might still be waiting, or climbing, or both. Not everything buried in the forest stays forgotten. The Quinault Rainforest occupies the southwestern quadrant of Olympic National Park, a temperate rainforest that receives over 12 feet of rainfall annually. It's one of the wettest places in the continental United States. The forest floor is a thick carpet of moss, ferns, and decaying wood layers built up over thousands of years. Sitka spruce and western red cedar grow to immense size here, some reaching heights of over 200 feet. The canopy is so dense that even at midday, the light beneath it is green and diffuse. Visibility rarely extends beyond 30 or 40 feet in any direction. The area has been home to the Quinault Indian Nation for millennia. Their oral histories speak of the forest as a place of transformation, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual is thin. Early European explorers in the late 1800s reported difficulty navigating the terrain, compasses behaved erratically, and landmarks seemed to shift. By the early 20th century, logging operations had stripped much of the surrounding lowlands, but the core rainforest remained untouched, eventually incorporated into the national park in 1938. In June of 1983, a surveyor named Leonard Casper was contracted by the U.S. Forest Service to update topographic maps of the Quinault River Valley. Casper was 51 at the time, a veteran of geological surveys across the Pacific Northwest. He'd worked in remote terrain for nearly 3 decades and was known for his meticulous fieldwork. On June 14th, he was conducting a ground survey approximately 2 miles north of the Quinault Ranger Station, working alone as was his usual practice. He was measuring elevation changes along a ridgeline when his transit rod punched through what he assumed was soft ground. Instead of soil, he hit something solid. Curious, he cleared away the moss and topsoil with a folding shovel. Beneath the organic layer, roughly 8 inches down, he found bedrock, a flat expanse of exposed basalt. And carved into that bedrock was a grid. The grooves were shallow, no more than half an inch deep, but perfectly uniform. Each line was straight, intersecting at precise 90-degree angles to form squares approximately 12 inches on each side. Casper spent the next 4 hours clearing more of the area. The grid extended in every direction he uncovered. He estimated it covered at least 2,000 square feet, possibly more. The lines showed no variation in depth or width. They were weathered smooth, as if they'd been there for a very long time. But there were no tool marks, no chisel strikes, no saw cuts, no evidence of any known method of carving stone. Casper took photographs with a 35mm camera and made detailed sketches in his field notebook. He marked the location with a cairn and flagging tape, then hiked back to the ranger station to report the find. He met with the head ranger, a man named Gerald Trask, who'd been stationed at Quinault for 6 years. Trask was skeptical. He asked if Casper had been working in an old logging area. Perhaps the grooves were remnants of skid roads or railway ties. Casper said no. The bedrock was virgin forest, untouched by industrial activity. Trask agreed to hike out with him the following day to inspect the site. They reached the location early. On the morning of June 16th, Casper's flagging tape was still in place. They cleared additional moss, expanding the exposed area by another 100 square feet. The grid continued. Trask took his own photographs. He later described the experience in a memo to the Regional Forest Service office. The precision is unnatural. I've seen a lot of geological formations, and this doesn't match anything I'm familiar with. It's not erosion. It's not glacial scoring. It looks intentional. Trask reported the discovery to his superiors. Within 10 days, a team from the University of Washington arrived to investigate. The team included 2 geologists, Dr. Margaret Aldridge and Dr. Haruto Yamada, and an archaeologist named Dr. Philip Grantham. They spent 3 days at the site, taking samples, measuring and documenting. Aldridge later wrote in her field notes that the grooves appeared to predate European contact, possibly by centuries, but there was no cultural context that explained them. The Quinault Nation had no oral tradition referencing such a structure, and Grantham found no artifacts, tool fragments, or other signs of human activity in the surrounding area. Yamada attempted to date the weathering on the grooves using a technique called rock varnish analysis, but the results were inconclusive. He noted that the stone showed evidence of prolonged exposure to moisture, but couldn't determine how long the grid had been exposed before being covered by forest debris. His report, filed in late July, suggested the grid could be anywhere from 200 to 2,000 years old or older. One detail troubled the team: the grid's alignment. Using a transit and compass, they determined that the lines ran almost perfectly north-south and east-west, deviating by less than 1 degree from true cardinal directions. Aldridge pointed out that such precision would require either advanced surveying tools or an intimate knowledge of celestial navigation. Neither seemed likely given the apparent age and isolation of the site. The university team submitted their findings to the Forest Service in August of 1983. Their report included photographs, diagrams, and rock samples. They recommended further study and suggested the site be documented for potential archaeological or historical significance. The Forest Service acknowledged receipt of the report but took no immediate action. Casper returned to the site in September. He'd been asked to complete his original survey and wanted to take additional measurements of the grid. When he arrived, the area had been disturbed. Fresh soil had been spread over the exposed bedrock. The grid was no longer visible. His flagging tape was gone. He dug down with his shovel and confirmed the grooves were still there, beneath 6 to 8 inches of newly deposited dirt. He contacted Trask, who said he had no knowledge of anyone covering the site. Trask made inquiries with the Park Service and was told the decision had been made at the regional level. No further explanation was provided. By October, the site had been removed from updated topographic maps. The coordinates Casper had recorded no longer matched the terrain features shown on official surveys. A service road that appeared on earlier maps, which would have provided easier access to the area, was absent from the new edition. Casper wrote a letter to the Forest Service requesting clarification. He received a brief reply stating that the area had been reclassified and was no longer open to survey work. He was thanked for his service and told his contract would not be renewed. Dr. Aldridge attempted to publish her findings in a geological journal in 1984. The paper was rejected. She was told the evidence was insufficient to support her conclusions. Yamada moved to a teaching position in Oregon shortly after and stopped researching the site. Grantham continued to ask questions, writing letters to the National Park Service and congressional representatives. His inquiries went unanswered. In 1986, he was reassigned to a project in Arizona and never returned to Washington. Trask remained at the Quinault Ranger Station until 1989. In an interview conducted years later, off the record, he said he'd tried to revisit the site in 1985, but couldn't locate it. The forest had grown back quickly, and without the flagging tape or updated maps, the landmarks were impossible to identify. "It's like it was never there," he said, or like someone wanted it that way. Casper kept his field notebook and photographs. He never spoke publicly about the grid, but he mentioned it occasionally to colleagues in private. In 2003, a journalist named Rebecca Talmadge contacted him while researching unexplained archaeological sites in the Pacific Northwest. He agreed to share his documentation, but asked not to be named in any publication. Talmadge's article was never published. The magazine that commissioned it folded before the piece could run. The Quinault Rainforest remains open to visitors, though access to certain backcountry areas requires permits that are rarely granted. No modern maps show the location Casper documented. The university samples taken in 1983 are no longer in storage. Records indicate they were transferred to a federal facility in 1987. But no tracking information exists beyond that. And beneath the moss, somewhere in the wet shadows of the rainforest, a grid of perfect lines still waits. Quiet, geometric, older than memory. Some children are seen but never known. Deer Lake sits at an elevation of 4,200 feet in the interior of Olympic National Park, nestled in a glacial cirque surrounded by subalpine meadows and stands of mountain hemlock. The lake itself is small, barely 3 acres, and remains partially frozen until late July most years. The trail leading to it is steep, gaining nearly 2,000 feet over 3 miles. and sees relatively light use compared to more accessible destinations in the park. The area was logged selectively in the early 1900s, but by the time the park was established in 1938, the forest had largely reclaimed the scars. The trail to Deer Lake was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1940, using hand tools and pack animals. It switchbacks through old-growth forest before breaking into open meadows just below the lake. The final quarter mile follows the edge of a rocky slope with views across the Dosa Wallops River Valley. It's quiet there. The wind moves through the trees but rarely carries sound from below. Hikers who've spent time at Deer Lake often describe it as unusually still, not unpleasant, but noticeable. On August 7th, 1971, a family from Olympia, Robert and Janet Holbrook, along with their 2 teenage daughters, hiked to Deer Lake for an overnight camping trip. It was their first visit to the area. They arrived in the early afternoon and set up their tent near the eastern shore. While the daughters explored the shoreline, Robert walked up the trail to take photographs of the meadow. About 50 yards past the lake, where the trail curves around a large boulder, he saw a boy standing in the grass. The boy appeared to be 7 or 8 years old. He was wearing a bright red windbreaker, blue jeans, and white sneakers. He stood facing the trail, hands at his sides, not moving. Robert assumed the boy was part of another hiking group and called out a greeting. The boy didn't respond. Robert walked closer, within 10 or 15 feet, and asked if the boy was lost. Still no response. The boy's expression was blank, not frightened or confused, just empty. Robert felt uncomfortable and returned to the campsite. He mentioned the encounter to his wife, who suggested they check on the boy again before dark. When they returned to the spot an hour later, the boy was gone. Robert took several photographs during the trip. One of them, shot from near the boulder, shows the meadow and the distant ridgeline. In the lower right corner of the frame, barely visible, is a small figure in red. The photograph was developed weeks later, and Robert filed it away with other family pictures. He didn't think much about it at the time. In July of 1976, a college student named Michael Pritchard hiked to Deer Lake with 3 friends. They were experienced backpackers, familiar with the Olympics. On their second day at the lake, Pritchard walked up the trail to scout a route toward Cameron Pass. Near the boulder, he saw a boy standing in the grass. Red windbreaker. Same spot. Pritchard approached and tried to speak to him. The boy didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't move. Pritchard waved his hand in front of the boy's face. Nothing. Unsettled, he returned to camp and told his friends. One of them, a woman named Laura Desmond, walked back with him to investigate. The boy was still there. Desmond took a photograph with her Polaroid camera. When they returned 10 minutes later with the other 2 members of their group, the boy had vanished. Desmond kept the Polaroid. It shows a boy, blurred slightly by distance, standing in the meadow. She later described the experience in a letter to a friend. It was like he wasn't really there, not a ghost, just absent, like looking at a photograph of a person instead of the person themselves. Over the next 13 years, at least 7 more groups reported similar encounters. The descriptions were consistent. A boy, around 8 years old, red windbreaker, standing near the boulder, unresponsive. In August of 1979, a ranger named Douglas Tennant was conducting a trail inspection and saw the boy. Tennant tried to make contact, even reaching out to touch the boy's shoulder, but stopped short. He later said he felt an overwhelming urge not to. He reported the incident to the ranger station, but was told there were no missing children in the park. No other groups were registered for the area that week. A Seattle photographer named Evelyn Marsh visited Deer Lake in September of 1982. She was shooting landscape images for a book on Washington wilderness. Near the boulder, she saw the boy and immediately raised her camera. She took 3 photographs before the boy vanished, not walked away, vanished. She reviewed the images that evening. All 3 showed the boy clearly. Same red windbreaker, same posture, same blank expression. Marsh submitted the photographs to the Park Service with a written account. She received no response. In 1985, two park rangers, Tennant and a younger ranger named Kyle Rafferty, hiked to Deer Lake specifically to investigate the reports. They spent 2 days at the site, observing the area near the boulder. On the second day, just before dusk, both men saw the boy. He appeared suddenly, standing in the same spot described in previous accounts. They approached slowly. Tennant spoke to the boy, asked his name, asked if he needed help. The boy didn't react. Rafferty estimated they were within 5 feet of him. Tennant later wrote in his report, "There was no sense of presence. It was like looking at a projection, but it wasn't translucent or faint. It was solid, real, just not alive." They tried to radio the ranger station, but couldn't get a signal. When they returned to the spot 15 minutes later, the boy was gone. Tennant submitted a formal incident report recommending further investigation. The report was acknowledged, but no action was taken. By 1987, the story had spread quietly among regular visitors to the park. Some hikers began avoiding Deer Lake. Others went specifically to see the boy, but sightings became less frequent. In June of 1988, a group of 4 hikers from Portland reported seeing him, but only for a few seconds before he disappeared. It was the second to last confirmed sighting. The final photograph was taken on September 9, 1989, by a man named Andrew Kowalski. He was hiking alone, something he did often. Near the boulder, he saw the boy and immediately felt he should document it. He used a 35mm camera with slide film. The image is sharp, well exposed, taken from about 20 feet away. The boy is standing in profile, facing west toward the ridgeline. His windbreaker is vivid red. His posture is neutral. His face shows no emotion. Kowalski tried to approach, but as he stepped closer, the boy turned his head and looked directly at him. Kowalski stopped. He described the boy's eyes as present, but not seeing. He stood there for several minutes, unsure what to do, before the boy simply ceased to be visible. Kowalski said it wasn't like watching someone walk away or fade. It was instantaneous. One moment the boy was there. The next, he wasn't. Kowalski reported the encounter to the ranger station on September 12th. 3 days later, the trail to Deer Lake was closed. The official reason given was erosion damage and unsafe conditions. No repair work was ever conducted. The closure became permanent in 1991. Park Service records from that period are sparse. Internal memos reference public safety concerns and ongoing assessment, but provide no specifics. Tennant, who had documented multiple encounters, retired in 1992. Rafferty transferred to a different park in 1993. Neither has spoken publicly about the incidents. Several of the photographs still exist. Robert Holbrook's daughter found his old slides in 2006 and had them digitized. Desmond's Polaroid was donated to a small museum in Port Angeles in 2011. Marsh's images were published briefly in a regional hiking guide in 1994, but were removed from subsequent editions. Kowalski's slide remains in his possession. He has declined multiple requests to share it. The trail to Deer Lake has not reopened. The Park Service lists it as closed indefinitely. Maps from before 1989 still show the route, but newer editions omit it entirely. The area can still be reached by experienced hikers willing to navigate off-trail, but few make the effort. And near a boulder above a small alpine lake, where the meadow meets the forest and the wind carries nothing, a space remains, empty now, or maybe just waiting. The red windbreaker folded somewhere between what was seen and what was possible. 18 years collapsed into a single afternoon. A boy who never grew older, never walked away, never answered when someone called his name. Not all transmissions come from towers. The Hoh rainforest covers approximately 24 square miles in the western interior of Olympic National Park, one of the largest temperate rainforests in the United States. Annual rainfall exceeds 14 feet in some areas, creating a landscape dominated by Sitka spruce, western hemlock, and bigleaf maple draped in club moss and ferns. The forest floor is a tangle of nurse logs and standing water. Sound behaves strangely here, absorbed by the dense vegetation, muffled, redirected. Voices rarely carry more than a few dozen feet. The area has been inhabited by the Hoh tribe for thousands of years. Their oral traditions describe the forest as a place where boundaries blur between earth and water, between silence and sound, between what is spoken and what is heard. Early settlers in the late 1800s reported compasses spinning unpredictably and a persistent sense of disorientation. By the mid-20th century, the rainforest had become a destination for scientists studying unique ecosystems, but it remained largely inaccessible to casual visitors. There are no paved roads. Cell service is non-existent. Radio communication is unreliable at best. On the morning of July 14, 2006, a research team from the University of Montana was conducting a wildlife survey near the Hoh River Trail, approximately 6 miles from the visitor center. The team consisted of 4 members: Dr. Patricia Keogh, a wildlife biologist; 2 graduate students, Daniel Ortega and Leah Novak, and a field technician named Marcus Jeffords. They were tracking Roosevelt elk populations using radio telemetry and had established a temporary camp near a bend in the river. At approximately 9:47 a.m., all 4 emergency radios in the camp began transmitting the same signal simultaneously. The radios were standard-issue portable units, operating on VHF frequencies reserved for Park Service and emergency use. They were set to different channels, but all of them picked up the transmission at once. The signal was clear. No static. A woman's voice, speaking in a flat, emotionless tone, reading a series of coordinates: 47 degrees, 51 minutes, 32 seconds north; 123 degrees, 56 minutes, 18 seconds west. A pause. Then 11 seconds of slow, rhythmic breathing. Then the coordinates again. The loop repeated without variation. Keogh recorded the transmission on a digital audio device. The team listened for nearly 3 minutes before Jeffords tried to respond over the radio. No acknowledgement. He switched channels. The transmission continued on every frequency. Ortega checked the GPS unit and entered the coordinates. The location was less than half a mile from their position, but the elevation reading showed negative 412 feet below ground. The team packed quickly and hiked toward the coordinates. The forest was dense, visibility limited to 10 or 15 feet. They reached the approximate location within 20 minutes. It was unremarkable. A slight depression in the forest floor, thick with moss and ferns. No standing water, no visible landmarks. Novak tested her radio. The transmission was louder here, clearer, as if they were standing next to the source. But there was nothing. No equipment, no structures, no signs of recent human activity. They remained at the site for over an hour, circling outward, searching for anything that might explain the signal. Ortega took soil samples. Jeffords used a metal detector to scan for buried objects. Nothing. At 11:15 a.m., the transmission stopped. Not gradually, it simply ceased mid-loop, cutting off in the middle of the word west. The radios went silent. They tried to re-establish contact, but received only static. Keogh reported the incident to the Park Service that afternoon. A ranger named Vincent Soriano took her statement and reviewed the audio recording. He contacted the regional office, which in turn notified the Federal Communications Commission. Within 48 hours, 2 FCC field agents arrived at the park: Thomas Ruiz and a woman identified only as Agent Carver in subsequent documents. They interviewed the research team separately, reviewed the audio file, and requested copies of all field notes and GPS data. Ruiz and Carver hiked to the coordinates on July 16th with Soriano and a Park Service technician named Harold Bisset. They brought radio direction finding equipment and spectrum analyzers. Bisset later described the operation in an email to a colleague. They were thorough, spent hours scanning every frequency, checking for interference, looking for transmitter signatures. Found nothing. Carver kept saying the signal shouldn't have been possible. Wrong band. Wrong propagation. No source. The agents expanded their search radius to over a mile. They checked for underground cables, buried antennas, anything that could generate or relay a transmission. Park Service records showed no infrastructure in the area. No old military installations. No communication equipment of any kind. The forest was pristine. On July 17th, the transmission returned. Same time, 9:47 a.m. Same coordinates. Same woman's voice. Same breathing. This time it lasted 6 minutes before stopping abruptly. Ruiz and Carver were at the site when it began. Carver's field report, partially redacted and later released through a Freedom of Information Act request, noted, "Signal origin undetermined. No electromagnetic source detected within operational range. Broadcast characteristics inconsistent with known transmission methods." 2 more occurrences were documented. July 18th at 9:47 a.m., lasting 4 minutes, and July 19th at the same time, lasting 90 seconds. Each time, the transmission was identical. After the July 19th broadcast, it stopped completely and never resumed. The FCC closed its investigation on July 20th, 2006. The official report, filed under case number 06-4732, concluded that the transmission was likely caused by atmospheric anomaly or equipment malfunction. No further explanation was provided. Ruiz and Carver left the park that afternoon. Soriano was told the case was resolved and required no additional action from park personnel. Keough attempted to follow up with the FCC in August. Her inquiries were redirected to a generic information line. She never received a substantive response. Ortega tried to publish a paper on the incident in 2007, framing it as an example of unexplained radio phenomena in remote environments. The paper was rejected by 3 journals. Reviewers noted a lack of reproducible data and suggested the team had misidentified a routine signal. Bisset, the park technician, kept detailed personal notes. In an interview conducted years later, he said, "The agents knew something we didn't. You could tell by how they talked to each other. Not scared, just careful, like they'd seen it before." No one has been able to identify the woman's voice. The audio file was analyzed by several independent experts who confirmed it was a human speaker, not synthesized or digitally generated. Linguistic analysis suggested the speaker was reading from prepared text, with no emotional inflection or variation across multiple loops. One analyst noted, the breathing pattern was unusually regular, almost metronomic. The coordinates themselves point to a location deep within the bedrock beneath the rainforest. Geological surveys of the area show no caverns, tunnels, or voids at that depth. The Olympic Mountains are composed of sedimentary rock and basalt, formed through ancient subduction and uplift. There is no known hollow space where a person or a transmitter could exist 400 feet below the surface. In 2009, a hiker named Ramon Gutierrez reported hearing a faint voice while camping near the Hoh River Trail. He couldn't make out words, but he described it as rhythmic, repetitive. He mentioned it to a ranger, who filed a brief note but took no action. In 2012, another visitor, a woman named Claudia Voss, submitted a comment card saying she'd heard someone counting while hiking alone near the same area. No coordinates were provided. No investigation was conducted. The research team's original audio recording remains in Keough's possession. She has shared it with journalists, researchers, and audio engineers. No one has been able to explain it. The FCC has not reopened the case. Park Service records list the incident as resolved with no additional detail. And somewhere beneath the moss and the ferns and the sound-swallowing trees, 400 feet below the forest floor where no room exists, coordinates wait in the dark. A woman's voice, patient and exact, reading numbers to no one. 11 seconds of breathing, then silence, then the numbers again. Some things grow in wood that shouldn't be there. Lake Crescent lies in the northern section of Olympic National Park, a crescent-shaped glacial lake over 8 miles long and reaching depths of 600 feet. The water is exceptionally clear. Visibility extends to 60 feet in some areas due to a lack of nitrogen in the ecosystem that prevents algae growth. The lake is surrounded by steep, forested slopes of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar, some over 500 years old. The area has been inhabited by the Klallam people for thousands of years, and their oral histories describe the lake as a place of transformation, where the boundary between the living and the dead is thin. In the early 20th century, the land around Lake Crescent was partially logged before being incorporated into the national park system in 1938. By 1950, most commercial timber operations had ceased, but small-scale salvage logging continued in designated areas under Park Service permits. The work was seasonal, conducted by local crews familiar with the terrain. In late April of 1952, a logging crew led by foreman Albert Dietrich was working on the southwestern shore of the lake, removing windfall and diseased trees under a Park Service contract. The crew consisted of 6 men, all from Port Angeles. On April 23rd, 2 crew members, brothers named Eugene and Howard Kearney, were delimbing a fallen Douglas fir when they noticed something unusual. The tree was seeping a clear liquid from several points along its trunk, not from obvious wounds or cuts, but from the bark itself. Eugene initially assumed it was resin, but the substance had no smell and didn't harden when exposed to air. It pooled on the bark and dripped slowly onto the ground. Howard called Dietrich over. As they watched, the liquid continued to flow, gathering in small depressions in the bark. Within minutes, the pooled sap had formed distinct shapes, letters, words. The phrase as recorded in Dietrich's handwritten log was, "Came back wrong." Dietrich assumed it was a prank. Perhaps someone had carved the words shallowly into the bark and the sap was following the grooves. But when he inspected the surface closely, he found no carvings, no tool marks, nothing that would explain the pattern. The letters were formed entirely by the way the liquid had pooled, as if guided by invisible channels beneath the bark. The crew cut into the tree. The interior wood was sound, showing no signs of disease or rot. But as they worked, more sap emerged from the fresh cuts, and again it pooled into words. This time, under the basin, Dietrich stopped the work. He collected samples of the sap in glass jars and took photographs with a Kodak Brownie camera. The images, later developed, show the bark surface and the pooled liquid, though the words are difficult to discern in the black and white prints. He reported the incident to the Park Service office at Lake Crescent the following day. A ranger named Francis Delacroix inspected the site on April 25th. He confirmed Dietrich's account and collected additional samples. In his written report, he noted, "The substance appears to be tree sap, but exhibits unusual behavior. The formation of legible text is unexplained. Recommend botanical analysis." 2 more trees were found exhibiting the same phenomenon over the next week. Both were Douglas firs within a quarter mile of the original site. One produced the phrase, "Don't look down." The other, "It's still breathing." Dietrich's crew refused to continue work in the area. The contract was suspended on May 2nd, and the logging operation was relocated to a different section of the park. Delacroix sent the samples to Dr. Raymond Falk, a botanist at the University of Washington, with a letter describing the circumstances. Falk received the samples in mid-May and began preliminary analysis. In a letter dated May 19th, he wrote to Delacroix, "The substance is chemically consistent with Douglas fir oleoresin, though it lacks the typical terpene compounds that give resin its characteristic odor. I can find no structural anomaly in the wood samples that would explain the patterned flow. This requires further investigation. Falk planned a field visit to Lake Crescent in June, but was delayed due to other commitments. He conducted additional lab tests on the samples throughout the summer. His notes, preserved in university archives, describe attempts to replicate the phenomenon under controlled conditions. He applied the sap to various surfaces, tested its viscosity, analyzed its chemical composition. Nothing explained how it formed letters. In September, Falk requested permission to examine the trees in person. The Park Service granted access, and he visited the site on September 12th with a graduate assistant named Lillian Hargrave. By then, the trees had stopped producing sap. Falk took core samples and bark scrapings, but found nothing unusual. He noted in his field journal, "Trees appear healthy, no active sap flow. Bark shows no evidence of external interference or carving. The event, if it occurred as described, has ceased." Dietrich and the Kearney brothers were interviewed again in October by a park naturalist named Konstanz Jablonski. All three men maintained their accounts. Eugene Kearney added a detail he hadn't mentioned previously. When the sap first began to flow, he heard a sound faint, like a voice speaking underwater. He couldn't make out words, only a rhythm. Howard confirmed hearing something similar, but described it as wind moving through the branches, though the air was still that day. Jablonski included these details in her report, but noted they were subjective and unverifiable. She recommended no further action, suggesting the incident was likely a natural but rare occurrence of sap extrusion influenced by environmental factors. Her report was filed, and the case was effectively closed. In January of 1954, Falk attempted to retrieve his samples from university storage to conduct follow-up tests. The samples were missing. Storage logs showed they had been checked out in November of 1953 by someone named Dr. Miles Fenwick. No such person was employed by the university. Falk filed an inquiry, but the samples were never recovered. He mentioned the incident in a letter to a colleague. "It's as if someone wanted to ensure no further analysis could be done." Falk continued his research into tree physiology, but never published findings related to the Lake Crescent incident. He retired in 1973 and passed away in 1981. Hargrave, his assistant, left the university in 1955 and became a high school science teacher in Oregon. She declined to discuss the incident in later years, telling a former student in the 1980s, "Some things don't have explanations. You just have to accept that." Dietrich kept his photographs and field log. His family donated them to the Clallam County Historical Society in 1997, where they remain in the archives. The images are faded but still show the trees and the crew at work. The words in the sap are barely visible, even under magnification. In 2003, a forestry student named Hannah Portillo was researching historical logging practices in Olympic National Park and came across Dietrich's log. She contacted the Park Service to inquire about the incident. She was told there were no records matching her description. When she provided the ranger's name Delacroix and the date, she was informed that personnel files from that period were incomplete due to a records transfer in the 1960s. Portillo visited the Lake Crescent area in 2004 and attempted to locate the original logging site using Dietrich's notes and the coordinates he'd estimated in his log. She found the general area, but couldn't identify specific trees. Douglas firs can live for several centuries, so it's possible the original trees are still standing, but without precise records, there was no way to confirm. She did note one detail in her research journal. Several Douglas firs near the estimated site showed unusual scarring on their bark. Smooth, shallow depressions that didn't match typical damage from insects, disease, or mechanical injury. She took photographs and bark samples but never had them analyzed. The project was abandoned when her academic advisor suggested the topic was too obscure for a thesis. The Lake Crescent area remains accessible to visitors. Thousands of people hike the trails each year. The forest is quiet, dense, and deeply green. The trees grow as they always have, rooted in soil that holds water and memory in equal measure. And if sap still flows from certain trunks in patterns that shouldn't exist, no one has reported it. Or perhaps no one has been willing to say what they saw pooling in the bark, forming words they couldn't explain and didn't want to read. Some people stop moving, but never stop being alive. Hurricane Ridge rises to an elevation of 5,242 feet in the northern section of Olympic National Park, offering panoramic views of the Olympic Mountains and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The ridge is accessible by a paved road that climbs 17 miles from Port Angeles, gaining nearly a mile in elevation through dense forest before breaking into subalpine meadows. The area receives significant snowfall, often over 30 feet annually, and weather conditions can shift rapidly. Fog banks roll in from the Pacific without warning, reducing visibility to near zero within minutes. The ridge has been a destination for tourists and hikers since the road was completed in 1958. During summer months, thousands visit weekly. By October, traffic drops sharply. The road typically closes for the season in early November, depending on snowfall. The terrain is exposed, with few trees to provide shelter. Temperatures can fall below freezing even during daylight hours. On October 17, 1998, two park rangers, Donna Erickson and Michael Tafoya, were conducting a routine trail inspection along the Hurricane Hill Path, a popular route that extends 1.6 miles from the parking area to a summit viewpoint. The trail is well maintained, wide, and clearly marked. Erickson and Tafoya left the visitor center at 8:30 a.m. under clear skies. Visibility was excellent. The forecast called for mild conditions with no precipitation expected. At approximately 9:15 a.m., about half a mile from the trailhead, they encountered a man standing on the trail. He was facing uphill, arms at his sides, completely motionless. He wore a light gray jacket, dark pants, and hiking boots. No backpack, no visible gear. Erickson called out to him. No response. They approached to within 10 feet. The man's eyes were open, fixed on the trail ahead. He didn't blink. He didn't acknowledge their presence. Tafoya stepped closer and waved his hand in front of the man's face. Nothing. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The jacket felt cold, colder than the ambient air temperature, which was 48 degrees. The man's skin, visible on his face and hands, had a pale, almost grayish tone. Tafoya asked if he was okay, if he needed help. No reaction. Erickson radioed the visitor center and requested medical assistance. While waiting, she checked the man's vital signs. His pulse was present, 62 beats per minute, regular and strong. His breathing was shallow but steady, approximately 10 breaths per minute. His pupils reacted normally to light, but he remained utterly unresponsive. No speech, no movement, no indication he was aware of his surroundings. A park medic named Sandra Velez arrived at 9:53 a.m. with a portable medical kit. She conducted a more thorough assessment. The man's body temperature, measured with an infrared thermometer on his forehead, was 83.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Velez repeated the measurement twice. Same reading. A core body temperature that low would typically indicate severe hypothermia, leading to confusion, loss of coordination, and eventual unconsciousness. But the man was standing upright, balanced, with no tremors or visible distress. His heart rate and respiratory function were normal for someone at rest. Velez attempted to move him. He resisted, not actively, but his body was rigid, almost locked in position. It took significant effort to shift his weight. She checked for medical alert bracelets or identification. Nothing. His pockets were empty. No wallet, no keys, no phone. Velez noted in her report, patient presents with paradoxical hypothermia symptoms, but remains ambulatory and stable, unresponsive to verbal or tactile stimuli, requires immediate transport. A Park Service vehicle was brought up the trail. With assistance, they were able to guide the man into the back seat. He moved stiffly, mechanically, as if his joints were frozen, but he didn't collapse. He sat upright, staring straight ahead. The drive to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles took 32 minutes. During the entire trip, the man did not move, did not speak, did not change expression. At the hospital, Dr. Lawrence Kincaid examined him in the emergency department. Kincaid had been practicing emergency medicine for 19 years and had treated countless cases of hypothermia, frostbite, and exposure. He found the man's condition baffling. Body temperature remained at 83 degrees. Blood pressure was 118/76 normal. Oxygen saturation was 98% normal. Electrocardiogram showed a regular sinus rhythm. Blood work revealed no drugs, no alcohol, no toxins. Thyroid function was normal. Glucose levels were normal. Kincaid attempted active rewarming using heated blankets and warm intravenous fluids. The man's temperature didn't change. He remained in the same rigid, unresponsive state. Neurological tests showed no signs of stroke, seizure, or traumatic brain injury. A CT scan of his head was unremarkable. Kincaid consulted with a neurologist, Dr. Amira Osman, who observed the patient for over an hour. Osman's notes described the case as catatonic presentation with unknown etiology and recommended psychiatric evaluation and extended observation. The man was admitted to a private room with continuous monitoring. Nurses checked on him every 30 minutes. He didn't sleep. His eyes remained open, unblinking. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't use the restroom. His vitals remained stable. Hours passed. The hospital contacted the Park Service to see if anyone had reported a missing person matching his description. No reports had been filed. At 1:47 a.m. on October 18th, 16 hours after he was found, a night shift nurse named Karen Delgado entered the room for a routine check. The man was sitting on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, as he had been positioned earlier. She approached to take his temperature. As she reached for the thermometer, the man stood up. Delgado stepped back, startled. He walked past her without looking at her, opened the door, and walked out into the hallway. Delgado followed, calling for assistance. The man moved steadily, purposefully, toward the exit. Security guard Raymond Polk intercepted him near the lobby. Polk placed a hand on the man's arm and asked him to stop. The man turned his head slightly, made brief eye contact, and then continued walking. Polk didn't restrain him. He later said he felt it was inappropriate to physically detain someone who wasn't violent or in immediate danger. The man walked out the front entrance of the hospital at 1:51 a.m. Delgado and Polk watched from the doorway. He crossed the parking lot, moving at a normal pace, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the property perimeter. Polk considered following, but decided to return inside and report the incident. By the time additional staff reached the parking lot, the man was gone. Hospital administration contacted the police. A brief search of the surrounding area was conducted, but yielded nothing. The patient's hospital bracelet, gown, and slippers had been left behind in the room. He had somehow changed back into his original clothing, the gray jacket and dark pants, despite no one observing him do so. Security footage reviewed later showed him walking out the front entrance, but did not capture how he obtained his clothes or where he went after leaving the property. The Park Service filed a report. Police conducted a cursory investigation, but found no missing persons matching the description. No identification could be established. The case was classified as a voluntary departure from medical care, and no further action was taken. Dr. Kincaid reviewed the medical records multiple times. He contacted colleagues at other hospitals to see if similar cases had been documented. None had. He wrote in his personal notes, "I've never seen anything like this. The physiology doesn't make sense. A person can't function normally at that temperature. And yet, he walked out on his own." Erickson, the ranger who first found him, returned to the Hurricane Ridge Trail several times over the following weeks. She asked hikers if they'd seen anyone matching the man's description. No one had. She checked the trailhead parking lot for abandoned vehicles. Nothing was found. In 2002, a journalist named Philip Navarro was researching unusual medical cases in the Pacific Northwest and came across a brief mention of the incident in hospital archives. He contacted Kincaid, who confirmed the details but declined to provide the patient's medical records due to privacy laws. Navarro attempted to locate the man through public records and missing persons databases. No matches were found. The hospital has no record of the man's admission under any name. Electronic records from that period were migrated to a new system in 2004, and some entries from 1998 were lost or corrupted. Kincaid retired in 2009 and passed away in 2017. Osman, the neurologist, left the hospital in 2001 and now practices in California. She declined to comment when contacted for this account. And somewhere between the ridge and the valley, a man with no name walked into the cold and never came back. Or perhaps he was never there at all, just a body that forgot how to be human, standing still on a trail where the air thins and the silence holds its breath. 83 degrees, eyes open, alive but not living, gone but never missing. Not all installations appear on maps, and not all of them stay where they're built. The Elwha River Valley cuts through the heart of Olympic National Park, draining the northern slopes of the Olympic Mountains before emptying into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. For thousands of years, the river supported one of the largest salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest until two dams were constructed in the early 20th century, the Elwha Dam in 1913 and the Glines Canyon Dam in 1927. The dams operated for nearly a century before being removed in a massive restoration project between 2011 and 2014. The valley is remote, steep-sided, and difficult to access. Dense forest covers most of the terrain, and fog from the coast frequently settles into the lowlands, obscuring visibility for days at a time. During the Cold War, the Olympic Peninsula became a site of strategic interest due to its proximity to naval installations and the Soviet Pacific Fleet's operational areas. Numerous military and scientific observation posts were established throughout the region, many of them classified. Most were decommissioned by the 1980s, their records archived or destroyed. In March of 2003, a historian named Gregory Ashford was researching Cold War-era infrastructure in Washington state for a book on military installations. While examining declassified Army Corps of Engineers documents at the National Archives, he found a reference that didn't match any known facility. The document, dated June 9, 1967, was a requisition request for construction materials, specifically reinforced concrete, steel framing, and electrical conduit to be delivered to Observation Post Elwha, Olympic National Park. The stated purpose was listed as monitoring periodic atmospheric events. The requisition was approved, but no follow-up documentation existed. No blueprints, no photographs, no completion report. Ashford searched for additional references and found two more mentions in unrelated documents: a budget allocation from 1968 for maintenance and staffing, OP Elwha, and a personnel transfer order from 1969 assigning a meteorologist named Dr. Edwin Lattimore to atmospheric observation duties, Elwha River Valley. Neither document provided coordinates or detailed descriptions of the facility. Ashford contacted the Army Corps of Engineers to request additional information. He was told that records for projects of that era were incomplete due to routine archival purges in the 1980s. He then reached out to Olympic National Park. The park historian, a woman named Judith Calloway, had no knowledge of any military installation called Observation Post Elwha. She checked historical surveys and land use records. Nothing matched. Ashford decided to investigate locally. In April of 2003, he traveled to Port Angeles and interviewed longtime residents who had lived in the area during the 1960s and 70s. Several people recalled hearing about a government station near the Elwha River, but had no direct knowledge of its purpose or location. One man, a retired logger named Walter Brennan, said he'd seen the structure once in 1971, while scouting timber access roads before the area was fully incorporated into the park. Brennan described it as a low, rectangular concrete building, partially buried in a hillside about 3 miles upriver from the lower dam. He estimated it was 30 feet long and 12 feet wide, with no windows and a single steel door. A small antenna array was mounted on the roof. He said the site was fenced with chain link and posted with "no trespassing" signs. He didn't approach closely, but noted the location on a hand-drawn map he kept for his work. When Ashford asked if he could visit the site, Brennan said he'd tried to find it again in the early 2000s during a hiking trip, but couldn't locate it. The terrain had changed, and his old map no longer matched the landscape. Another resident, a woman named Frances Kowalczyk, remembered her late husband mentioning the station. He had worked as a truck driver, delivering supplies to remote sites in the Olympic Mountains during the 1960s. She said he'd made at least 3 deliveries to a bunker near Elwha between 1968 and 1970. He described the personnel there as quiet, unfriendly, and secretive. They unloaded the supplies themselves and never allowed him past the fence. She recalled him saying the place felt wrong, though she didn't press him for details. Ashford attempted to locate Dr. Edwin Lattimore, the meteorologist mentioned in the 1969 transfer order. He found no employment records, no published research, no obituary. A search of meteorological societies and academic institutions yielded nothing. It was as if Lattimore had never existed outside that single document. In May of 2003, Ashford hiked into the Elwha River Valley with topographic maps and Brennan's hand-drawn sketch. He focused on an area roughly 3 miles upstream from the old dam site, where the terrain matched Brennan's description, a steep, forested hillside with limited visibility and difficult access. He spent 2 days searching, but found no trace of a structure, no concrete foundation, no disturbed soil, no remnants of fencing or antenna mounts. He expanded his search radius and returned twice more over the following month. Nothing. While reviewing satellite imagery from the 1970s, Ashford noticed an anomaly. A USGS aerial survey from October of 1971 showed a small clearing on a hillside near the coordinates he'd been searching. The clearing was roughly rectangular, consistent with Brennan's description. A follow-up survey from August of 1972, taken less than a year later, showed the same hillside, fully forested, with no clearing visible. Ashford contacted the USGS to inquire about the discrepancy. He was told that vegetation growth in the Pacific Northwest could be rapid, but the complete erasure of a cleared site in under a year was unusual. He shared his findings with Calloway, the park historian. She agreed to conduct an internal search of park records. In July of 2003, she found a brief mention in a 1972 land survey report. The surveyor, a man named Thomas Everett, noted encountering concrete debris and metal fragments near the Elwha River during a boundary assessment. He recorded the approximate location but made no further comment. Calloway checked the coordinates. They matched Ashford's search area. Ashford returned to the site in August with a metal detector and excavation tools. He found small fragments of rusted metal and pieces of concrete buried under several inches of soil and forest debris. The fragments were consistent with construction materials, but provided no definitive evidence of a structure. He collected samples and had them analyzed. The concrete was dated to the mid-20th century based on its composition, but no more specific date could be determined. In September, Ashford submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Defense, specifically asking for any records related to Observation Post ELWA, atmospheric monitoring projects in Olympic National Park, or personnel assignments for Dr. Edwin Lattimore. The request was acknowledged, but took over 18 months to process. When he finally received a response in March of 2005, most of the documents were heavily redacted. The few readable sections confirmed that a project related to atmospheric observation had been authorized in the ELWA area in the late 1960s, but provided no operational details. A note at the end of the file stated, "Project discontinued, 1971. Facility decommissioned and removed." No explanation was given for why a decommissioned facility would leave no physical trace, no demolition records, no environmental impact assessments, no disposal manifests for the materials. It was as if the structure had been erased deliberately and thoroughly. Ashford attempted to contact Walter Brennan again in 2006 to see if he recalled any additional details. Brennan had passed away in 2004. Frances Kowalczyk's husband had died in 1993, and she had no written records of his deliveries. Thomas Everett, the surveyor who noted the concrete debris, had retired to Arizona and declined to be interviewed, saying he didn't remember the specifics of a survey conducted over 30 years prior. Ashford's book was published in 2008. It included a chapter on Observation Post ELWA, presenting the available evidence and acknowledging the gaps. The chapter generated some interest among Cold War historians, but no new information surfaced. The Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Defense never provided further clarification. In 2012, during the ELWA Dam removal project, construction crews working in the valley uncovered a concrete slab buried under sediment near the old dam site. The slab was rectangular, approximately 8 feet by 6 feet, with embedded anchor bolts suggesting it had supported a structure. The location was miles downstream from where Ashford had been searching, but the discovery reignited his interest. He contacted the project manager, who said the slab was documented and then reburied as part of the restoration work. No one knew what it had supported or when it had been installed. And somewhere in the forested hills above the ELWA River, where the fog settles thick and the trees grow over old wounds, a space remains a place where something once stood to count or watch or listen. The coordinates are approximate, the records are incomplete, the people who knew are gone, but the concrete fragments are still there, buried beneath moss and memory, marking a station that monitored something the world wasn't supposed to know. Sometimes fog doesn't just obscure, it opens. Ozette Lake sits at the westernmost point of the contiguous United States, 3 miles inland from the Pacific coast in the northwestern corner of Olympic National Park. The lake is the largest natural body of freshwater in Washington, stretching nearly 8 miles long and covering over 3,000 acres. It's surrounded by old-growth forest and connected to the ocean by the Ozette River, a short waterway that empties into the Pacific near Cape Alava. The area has been inhabited by the Makah tribe for thousands of years, and archaeological sites along the coast have yielded artifacts dating back centuries. The lake itself is remote, accessible only by a dirt road that winds through dense timber, ending at a small ranger station and boat launch. Fog is a constant presence at Ozette. Marine air from the Pacific rolls inland most evenings, blanketing the lake in thick gray mist that can reduce visibility to a few feet. The fog often lingers until late morning, trapped between the forest and the water. Hikers and campers describe it as unusually dense, almost tactile, and disorienting. The Makah have stories about the fog at Ozette, stories that describe it as a threshold, a place where the physical world becomes uncertain. In early August of 1979, a group of 12 people, members of a Seattle-based hiking club, arrived at Ozette Lake for a 3-day camping trip. The group ranged in age from 24 to 56 and included experienced outdoor enthusiasts familiar with the Olympic Peninsula. They set up camp on the northern shore of the lake, near a clearing accessible by a short trail from the parking area. The weather was mild, with clear skies and temperatures in the mid-60s during the day. Evening fog was expected but not considered unusual. On the night of August 9th, the group went to bed around 10:30 p.m. They had set up their tents in a loose arrangement along the shoreline, spaced roughly 15 to 20 feet apart. According to later accounts, the fog rolled in around 11 p.m., thicker than usual. Visibility dropped to near zero. The air became still, no wind, no sound from the lake, just the heavy presence of moisture. At 3:47 a.m., all 12 campers woke simultaneously. Several of them noted the exact time because they checked their watches immediately, disturbed by the abruptness of waking. What they found outside their tents was impossible to reconcile with where they had gone to sleep. The tents had been moved. All 12 were now arranged in a perfect circle, each one facing inward toward a central point. The circle was approximately 40 feet in diameter. The arrangement was precise, equidistant spacing, aligned orientation. None of the campers recalled moving their tents. None had heard anything during the night. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. All 12 campers reported the same dream. They described walking through fog so dense it felt solid, almost architectural. Within the fog, they encountered doorways, rectangular openings carved into the mist itself, framed by slightly darker gray. The doorways led to rooms, empty rooms, also made of fog. No furniture, no landmarks, just enclosed spaces with walls that shifted slightly when approached. Some campers reported walking through multiple rooms. Others described standing in a single room for what felt like hours. The rooms had no sound, no echo, just silence and the sense of being contained. One camper, a teacher named Margaret Lindstrom, wrote in her journal the following day, "I walked through at least 5 doorways. Each one led to another room. The walls weren't solid, but they felt real. I kept thinking I should turn back, but I couldn't find the way I came in. Then I woke up, and my tent was somewhere I didn't put it." Another camper, a journalist named Peter Hargrove, described the dream in an interview years later. "It was like being inside a building that didn't exist. The fog had geometry. I remember reaching out to touch a wall, and my hand went through it, but I could still see the wall there, as clear as anything. When I woke up, I was disoriented. I didn't recognize where I was for a few seconds." A structural engineer named David Sorensen recalled, "The doorways were identical, same height, same width, maybe 6.5 feet tall, 3 feet wide, perfect rectangles. And they were all oriented the same way, like a hallway in a building. I walked in a straight line through maybe 7 or 8 of them before I woke up." None of the 12 campers knew each other well. Most had only met through the hiking club within the past year. They had not discussed dreams before going to sleep. Yet their descriptions aligned with unsettling consistency: fog, doorways, empty rooms, silence. When dawn broke around 6 a.m., the fog began to lift. The campers inspected the area. The ground showed no signs of the tents being dragged or carried. No footprints other than their own. No tracks from animals or vehicles. The tent stakes were still firmly in the ground, as if the tents had been set up in their new positions from the start. Personal belongings inside the tents were undisturbed. Sleeping bags, backpacks, clothing, all exactly where they had been left. Lindstrom measured the circle, 42 feet in diameter. She used a compass to check the orientation of each tent. All 12 were facing exactly toward the center, aligned within a few degrees. Sorensen, the engineer, noted that achieving such precision would require careful planning and measurement. "You couldn't do this by accident," he said in his written account. "Someone would have needed surveying equipment, or at least a good understanding of geometry." The group reported the incident to the ranger station later that morning. The ranger on duty, a man named Clayton Voss, took their statements but seemed skeptical. He noted the details in a logbook, but suggested the campers had experienced a shared disorientation caused by the fog and possibly sleepwalking. When pressed about the tent arrangement, he said it was possible the group had unconsciously moved their tents during the night without fully waking. Hargrove, the journalist, pointed out that 12 people sleepwalking simultaneously and arranging themselves in a perfect geometric pattern was statistically implausible. Voss acknowledged the strangeness, but offered no alternative explanation. The group broke camp that afternoon and returned to Seattle. Hargrove wrote an article about the experience for a local alternative newspaper. The article was published in September of 1979, under the headline, "The Night the Fog Had Doors." It received little attention outside of niche outdoor enthusiast circles. A few readers wrote in with similar stories, vague accounts of disorienting fog and strange dreams, but none provided verifiable details or matched the specificity of the Ozette incident. In October, Hargrove contacted the National Weather Service to inquire about unusual atmospheric conditions on the night of August 9th. A meteorologist named Dr. Elaine Kowalski reviewed weather data for the area. She confirmed that fog had been present, but noted nothing anomalous. Temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure were all within normal ranges for coastal Washington in summer. She suggested the campers may have experienced a phenomenon known as proprioceptive drift, where disorientation in low visibility leads to altered perception of space. However, she acknowledged this didn't explain the tent arrangement or the shared dream content. Lindstrom attempted to organize a follow-up trip to Ozette in the summer of 1980, inviting the original 12 campers to return. Only 4 agreed. They camped at the same location in late July. Fog rolled in as expected, but nothing unusual occurred. No shared dreams, no rearranged tents. The group returned without incident. Over the years, a few other visitors to Ozette Lake reported strange experiences involving fog and disorientation, though none matched the detail or consistency of the 1979 event. In 1987, a couple camping near the southern shore reported waking to find their tent facing a different direction than they remembered, though they admitted they could have been mistaken. In 1993, a solo hiker described a dream of walking through walls made of cloud, but provided no additional context. Park Service records contain only brief mentions of the original incident. Voss, the ranger who took the initial report, retired in 1985 and passed away in 2002. His logbook was archived, but contains no follow-up notes beyond the initial entry. Hargrove kept in touch with several of the campers over the decades. In a 2012 email to Lindstrom, he wrote, "I still think about that night. Not often, but when fog rolls in heavy, I remember the doors. I've never had another dream like it. Part of me wants to go back, but another part knows I shouldn't." Sorensen, the engineer, mentioned the incident in a memoir published in 2015. He wrote, "I've designed buildings for 30 years. I understand structure, materials, space. But I can't explain what I experienced that night. The fog had architecture. That's the only way I can describe it. And I walked through it. And somewhere on the shore of Ozette Lake, where the fog rolls in thick from the Pacific and the forest stands silent in the dark, 12 points mark the memory of a circle, empty spaces facing inward, doorways that opened once and led nowhere, a shared crossing through mist that held the shape of rooms no one built and no one can find again." Silence isn't always the absence of noise. Sometimes it's the presence of something else. Rialto Beach stretches along the Pacific coast in the northwestern section of Olympic National Park, a rugged shoreline defined by massive driftwood logs, sea stacks rising from the surf, and dark volcanic sand. The beach is approximately 1.5 miles long, accessible by a short trail from the parking area at Mora Road. The coastline here is wild and exposed. Winter storms bring waves that exceed 20 feet, reshaping the beach with each tide. The sound of the ocean is constant waves crashing, wind moving through the driftwood, the distant calls of gulls and cormorants. It's one of the loudest places in the park. The area has been significant to the Quilio tribe for thousands of years. Their oral traditions describe the coast as a place where the boundary between worlds is thin, where spirits move between the ocean and the land. Early European explorers in the 1800s noted the area's treacherous conditions, sudden fog, unpredictable currents, and a persistent sense of disorientation. Several ships ran aground along this stretch of coast in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The wrecks were salvaged or reclaimed by the sea, but local stories about the beach persisted, accounts of strange lights, voices heard in the wind, and sections of shoreline where compasses behaved erratically. On June 3, 2003, a marine biologist named Dr. Evelyn Pritchard arrived at Rialto Beach to conduct a survey of intertidal ecosystems. Pritchard had been studying tide pool habitats along the Olympic coast for 7 years and was familiar with the area. She arrived in the early afternoon with 2 research assistants, Samuel Brooks, a graduate student, and Naomi Ishikawa, a field technician. They planned to spend 3 days documenting species distribution and collecting water samples. The weather was overcast but mild, typical for early June. Visibility was good. The tide was low, exposing tide pools and rocky outcrops. Pritchard and her team began their survey at the southern end of the beach, near the trailhead. By mid-afternoon, they had moved approximately 200 yards north along the shoreline. That's when they noticed the silence. The sound of the ocean had stopped. Not gradually, it simply ceased. Waves continued to strike the sand, foam spreading across the beach, but there was no sound. No crash, no hiss of water receding over stone, no ambient roar. Pritchard stopped and looked out at the surf. The waves were normal, 6 to 8 feet, breaking rhythmically about 30 yards offshore. But they made no noise. Brooks called out to Pritchard. His voice sounded muffled, distant, as if he were speaking from behind a thick pane of glass. Pritchard tried to respond, but her own voice felt absorbed, swallowed by the air. Ishikawa dropped a metal collection container. It hit a rock with no clang, no impact sound, just silence. The 3 of them stood still, trying to process what was happening. The wind was blowing, they could feel it, see it moving through the driftwood and grasses, but there was no sound. Gulls circled overhead, their beaks opening and closing in what should have been calls, but nothing reached them. It was as if sound itself had been removed from a specific area, a zone that extended roughly 200 yards along the beach and perhaps 50 yards inland. Pritchard checked her watch. 3:27 p.m. She marked the location on her GPS unit and took photographs. The images showed a normal beach scene: waves, driftwood, overcast sky. Nothing visually unusual, but standing there, experiencing it, was deeply disorienting. Pritchard later described it in her field notes. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt wrong, invasive, like something had been taken from the environment, and the absence left a void we could feel, but not see. They attempted to move out of the silent zone. Walking south, back toward the trailhead, sound gradually returned, first faint, then normal, within about 20 yards. The transition was abrupt, almost like crossing a threshold. Brooks described it as stepping through a curtain. On one side, silence. On the other, the full acoustic environment of the coast. They returned to the silent zone multiple times over the next hour, testing its boundaries. The zone appeared to be fixed in location, extending from approximately GPS coordinates 47.92 degrees north, 124.64 degrees west, and stretching 200 yards north. The silence was consistent, complete absence of sound, regardless of what activity occurred within the zone. Pritchard contacted the Park Service that evening. A ranger named Vincent Mallory met with them the following morning. Mallory was skeptical, but agreed to visit the site. At 8:15 a.m. on June 4th, Mallory, Pritchard, Brooks, and Ishikawa walked to the location. The silence was still present. Mallory threw a piece of driftwood into the surf within the zone. The splash produced no sound, he shouted. His voice was muffled, barely audible even at close range. He stepped out of the zone and shouted again. Normal volume. Mallory radioed the park headquarters and requested assistance. By afternoon, 2 additional rangers, Laura Quintero and James Kuczynski, had arrived with audio recording equipment. They set up microphones at various points within and outside the silent zone. The recordings made outside the zone captured normal beach sounds, waves, wind, birds. The recordings made inside the zone captured only faint static and occasional low-frequency hums, as if the equipment itself was struggling to process the absence of sound. Over the next week, the silent zone remained. Word spread quietly among park staff and local residents. A few visitors to the beach reported the phenomenon, though many assumed it was a perceptual issue or didn't notice anything unusual if they entered the zone without prior context. On June 9th, a physicist from the University of Washington named Dr. Marcus Delgado visited the site. Delgado had experience studying acoustic anomalies and brought specialized equipment to measure sound pressure levels and air density. His findings were inconclusive. Sound pressure levels within the zone registered near zero, consistent with the subjective experience of silence, but he could find no physical explanation. Air density, temperature, humidity, all normal. There was no barrier, no material obstruction, nothing that would absorb or deflect sound waves. Delgado conducted tests with speakers, generating tones at various frequencies. Outside the zone, the tones were clearly audible. Inside, they disappeared or were reduced to barely perceptible vibrations. It's as if sound is being removed at the source, Delgado said in a recorded interview. Not blocked or absorbed in the traditional sense, but prevented from propagating entirely. I've never encountered anything like it. The Park Service restricted access to the affected section of beach on June 12th, citing ongoing environmental assessment. Signs were posted at the trailhead, though no specific reason was provided to the public. By this time, the silent zone had persisted for 9 days. Local media began reporting on the story, though coverage was limited to regional outlets. A journalist named Rebecca Tanaka from a Port Angeles newspaper visited the site and confirmed the phenomenon in a June 14th article. Her piece described the experience as profoundly unsettling and noted that several visitors had reported feeling nauseous or disoriented after spending extended time in the zone. On June 16th, a team from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration arrived to investigate potential connections to oceanographic conditions. They measured wave patterns, tidal cycles, and underwater topography. Everything appeared normal. Waves within the silent zone behaved identically to waves outside its same height, same frequency, same energy. The silence was purely acoustic, not mechanical. The zone remained for 6 more days. During this time, Pritchard and her team continued to visit, documenting any changes. None were observed. The boundaries remained fixed. The silence remained absolute. Then, on the morning of June 25th, at approximately 6:12 a.m. sunrise, the sound returned. Mallory was at the site conducting a routine check when it happened. He later described it in his incident report. I was standing at the southern boundary of the zone, just inside the silent area. The sun broke over the horizon, and within seconds, maybe 5 or 10, I could hear the waves again. Not gradually. It was like someone flipped a switch. Full sound, instant. The zone was tested throughout the day. Sound levels were normal. Audio equipment recorded typical beach acoustics. Whatever had caused the silence was gone. The Park Service reopened the section of beach on June 27th. No explanation was provided. Internal reports described the event as an unexplained acoustic anomaly and recommended continued monitoring, but no further incidents occurred. Delgado attempted to publish his findings in an acoustics journal in 2004. The paper was rejected. Reviewers noted a lack of reproducible data and suggested the measurements may have been affected by equipment malfunction. Delgado disagreed, but never pursued publication elsewhere. Pritchard mentioned the incident in her dissertation, but only briefly, focusing instead on her primary research. Brooks and Ishikawa moved on to other projects. The Park Service archived the incident reports, but never conducted a formal investigation. When contacted years later, Mallory said he'd been told to document what happened, but not to speculate about causes. "We saw what we saw," he said in a 2010 interview. But no one had an explanation, so the case just sat there. Eventually, people stopped asking about it. And on Rialto Beach, where the waves break endlessly and the wind moves through the driftwood, a 200-yard section of sand remembers 3 weeks when sound stopped existing. The ocean still crashes there. Voices still carry. But sometimes, on certain mornings when the light comes low across the water, visitors report a faint sense of absence, not silence exactly, but the memory of it, a space where something was removed and never fully returned. Some images are repeated not because they're remembered, but because they're seen. Solduke Falls lies in the northern interior of Olympic National Park, accessible by a paved road that follows the Solduke River Valley through dense old-growth forest. The falls themselves drop nearly 50 feet into a narrow gorge, carved through basalt, creating a thunderous cascade that can be heard from a quarter-mile away. The area has been a destination for visitors since the early 20th century, when a resort was built near the hot springs a few miles downstream. The resort operated intermittently until the 1960s, drawing tourists seeking the mineral waters and proximity to wilderness. Several small structures were built in the area during the 1930s and 40s to support park operations, ranger cabins, storage sheds, and maintenance buildings. Most were decommissioned by the 1970s as operations centralized at larger facilities. By the mid-80s, many of these structures had fallen into disrepair, their locations known only through outdated maps and occasional references in maintenance logs. On May 14, 1988, a 3-person park maintenance crew was tasked with surveying old structures in the Solduke area to assess their condition and determine whether they should be preserved or removed. The crew consisted of Supervisor Gerald Hutchins and 2 seasonal workers, Kimberly Vargas and Thomas Whitmore. They were working from a list of coordinates compiled from records dating back to the 1940s. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the crew located a small cabin roughly 1.2 miles northeast of Solduke Falls, accessible only by an overgrown service trail that hadn't been maintained in decades. The cabin was a single-room log structure, approximately 12 feet by 16 feet, with a peaked roof and 1 small window. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly off its hinges. Hutchins entered first to assess structural stability. The interior was dim, illuminated only by light filtering through the window and gaps in the roof where shingles had rotted away. The floor was dirt, compacted and dry. There was no furniture, just bare walls and a small stone fireplace in one corner. And covering nearly every surface of the interior walls, from floor to ceiling, were drawings, hundreds of them, rendered in charcoal or some similar dark medium, all depicting the same image: a humanoid figure standing in what appeared to be a valley or depression in the ground, arms at its sides. Above the figure, a circle perfectly round, with 7 straight lines radiating outward like spokes or rays. The composition was identical in every drawing, though the scale and execution varied. Some were small, no larger than a hand. Others covered entire sections of wall stretching 4 or 5 feet in height. Vargas and Whitmore entered behind Hutchins. All 3 stood in silence, taking in the scene. The drawings were meticulous. The lines were confident, precise, showing a level of skill and control that suggested trained hands. But scattered throughout the cabin, at irregular intervals, were handprints, small handprints, pressed into the charcoal or applied in the same dark medium, children's hands. Hutchins counted over 300 individual drawings before losing track. The repetition was overwhelming. The same figure, the same circle, the same 7 lines. Vargas noted that the drawings appeared to have been made over an extended period. Some were faded, barely visible, while others were darker, more recent. The charcoal or pigment used had the consistency of compressed willow or burned wood, common materials available in the forest. Whitmore examined the handprints. He estimated the prints came from children between the ages of 4 and 10 based on the size. He counted at least 12 distinct handprints, though some were overlapping or smudged, making it difficult to get an exact number. The prints were not random. They were placed deliberately, often next to or beneath the drawings, as if signing them. Hutchins photographed the interior with a 35mm camera, taking wide shots and close-ups of individual drawings and handprints. He then radioed the park headquarters to report the find. The district ranger, a woman named Patricia Kelso, instructed him to document everything, but not to disturb the site. She said she would contact the park historian and possibly an archaeologist to assess the drawings. The crew completed their documentation by late afternoon and returned to the main office. Hutchins submitted his photographs and a written report the following day. Kelso reviewed the materials and forwarded them to the regional office with a request for guidance on how to proceed. Within a week, a team arrived from the University of Washington, 2 anthropologists, Dr. Helen Kowalski and Dr. Raymond Stiles, and an art historian named Dr. Lucille Brennan. They visited the cabin on May 23rd and spent several hours examining the drawings. Kowalski took measurements and made sketches. Stiles attempted to date the charcoal using a portable ultraviolet lamp, which suggested varying ages, though he couldn't provide precise dates without lab analysis. Brennan focused on the style and technique, noting in her field notes that the skill level was inconsistent with the apparent age of the handprints. In her preliminary report, Brennan wrote, "The drawings demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of perspective and proportion. The execution is deliberate and confident. However, the presence of children's handprints introduces a significant contradiction. Either the drawings were made by adults and signed by children, or the children possess an unusual level of artistic ability." Kowalski interviewed Hutchins, Vargas, and Whitmore separately to gather more context. All 3 confirmed there were no other objects in the cabin, no art supplies, no bedding, no food containers, no evidence of recent habitation. The floor showed no signs of disturbance beyond footprints from the crew. Kowalski asked if there were any local stories or folklore about the area. Hutchins said he'd worked in the park for 11 years and had never heard of anything related to the cabin or children drawing on walls. The team returned to the university to analyze their findings. Stiles sent samples of the charcoal to a lab for radiocarbon dating. The results, received in early June, were inconclusive. The samples showed ages ranging from 20 to over 100 years, suggesting either contamination or the use of wood from trees of varying ages. Brennan consulted with colleagues in child psychology and art education, asking whether children could produce drawings of such technical quality. The consensus was that while some children show exceptional skill, the uniformity and repetition suggested something beyond typical child behavior. In late June, Kelso received a directive from the regional park office. The cabin was to be demolished. The official reason given was structural instability and potential safety hazards to visitors who might stumble upon it. Kelso objected, arguing that the site warranted further study. Her objection was noted but overruled. A demolition crew was scheduled for July. Hutchins was not assigned to the demolition but learned about it from other staff. He returned to the cabin on his own on June 28th to take additional photographs before it was destroyed. When he arrived, he found that someone had already begun removing sections of the walls. Several large pieces of the interior paneling, bearing the drawings, had been pried loose and were lying on the ground outside the cabin. Hutchins photographed the scene and reported it to Kelso. who said she had no knowledge of anyone being authorized to remove materials from the site. The cabin was demolished on July 9, 1988. A crew used chainsaws and hand tools to dismantle the structure, which was then burned on site. No inventory was taken of the drawings. No additional documentation was conducted. The site was cleared and left to return to forest. Kowalski attempted to publish her findings in an anthropology journal in 1989. The paper was rejected with a note that the evidence was too fragmentary to support meaningful analysis. She revised and resubmitted to a regional folklore journal, which accepted the piece but published it in a limited circulation issue that received little attention. Stiles moved to a position in Alaska in 1990 and did not pursue the matter further. Brennan included a brief mention of the drawings in a book on Pacific Northwest art in 1993, but the section was edited down to a single paragraph at the publisher's request. Hutchins kept his photographs. In 2006, he donated them to the Clallam County Historical Society, where they remain in the archives. The images show the interior of the cabin, the repetitive drawings, and the small handprints. Researchers who have reviewed the photographs note the unsettling consistency of the imagery and the absence of any contextual information that might explain the drawing's origin or purpose. No records exist of children going missing in the Solduk area during the periods when the drawings might have been made. No reports of youth groups, art programs, or educational activities that would involve children drawing in a remote, abandoned cabin. The nearest school was over 20 miles away, and there is no documented history of organized trips to that specific location. And in the forest near Solduk Falls, where the trees grow thick and the sound of water fills the air, the ground holds the ashes of a cabin that once contained 300 images of the same thing. A figure in a valley, a circle above, 7 lines reaching outward, drawn by hands too skilled to be children's, signed by prints too small to be anything else. A message repeated until the walls couldn't hold any more, then burned, then forgotten. Except by those who saw the photographs and couldn't forget the precision, the repetition, the small hands pressed into the charcoal like signatures on a contract no one remembers signing. Not every descent was carved by water. The Staircase Rapids lie in the southeastern corner of Olympic National Park, where the North Fork Skokomish River cuts through steep terrain in a series of cascading drops that resemble a natural staircase, hence the name. The area sits at the boundary between lowland temperate rainforest and subalpine wilderness, surrounded by peaks that reach over 6,000 feet. The Skokomish tribe has inhabited the river valley for thousands of years, and their oral histories describe the deeper reaches of the mountains as places where the earth opens in ways that defy natural formation. The park established a ranger station and campground at Staircase in the 1920s, and the area became a popular access point for backcountry hiking. But beneath the forest and the river, the Olympic Mountains conceal a network of limestone caves and passages formed over millions of years by groundwater dissolution. Most are small, poorly mapped, and difficult to access. The Park Service discourages cave exploration due to safety concerns, and few detailed surveys exist. On October 8, 2011, a group of 4 recreational cavers members of the Cascade Grotto, a regional spelunking organization, obtained a permit to explore a known cave system approximately 2 miles west of the Staircase Ranger Station. The team consisted of Michael Peterson, the group leader with 15 years of caving experience, his partner, Andrea Vasquez, and 2 other members, Derek Hollings and Sasha Novikova. They entered the cave system at 9:45 a.m., carrying helmets, headlamps, rope, and basic surveying equipment. The known portion of the cave extended roughly 300 feet into the hillside, ending in a chamber where a small stream disappeared into a crack too narrow for human passage. Peterson had explored the cave twice before and knew the layout. This trip was intended as a routine survey to update maps and check for any changes in the passage structure. At approximately 11:20 a.m., while examining the back of the terminal chamber, Hollings noticed something unusual. A section of the wall, partially obscured by flowstone deposits, showed signs of artificial working straight edges, regular angles. He called the others over. Using a small hammer, they carefully chipped away at the flowstone. Beneath it was stone that had been cut and fitted blocks, not natural rock formations. They worked for nearly an hour, clearing enough material to reveal an opening. Behind the wall was a passage. Not a natural cave passage, but a corridor roughly 5 feet wide, 7 feet tall, with walls that were too smooth and too uniform to be the result of erosion. The floor was flat, and descending into the darkness was a staircase. The steps were carved from the same stone as the walls, each one approximately 10 inches tall and 12 inches deep. The angles were precise. The descent was steep but consistent. Peterson estimated it at 30 to 35 degrees. They illuminated the passage with their headlamps. The staircase continued beyond the range of their lights, disappearing into the earth. The team debated whether to proceed. They had enough supplies for several more hours underground, but this was not part of their planned route, and they had no information about where the passage might lead. Peterson decided they would descend cautiously, documenting as they went, and turn back if conditions became unsafe. They began the descent at 12:35 p.m. The stairs were uniform, no variation in height or depth, no wear patterns, no cracks. Peterson counted steps aloud. At step 100, the passage remained unchanged, straight, descending, and featureless. The air was cool and still. There was no sound except their footsteps and breathing. At step 200, Vasquez noted that the walls showed faint tool marks, parallel grooves consistent with chiseling, but very old, smoothed by time. The rock was limestone, the same geology as the surrounding cave system, but the construction was deliberate, purposeful. At step 300, Novikova began to feel uneasy. She later described it as a pressure, not physical but psychological, like being watched. Hollings felt it too. They suggested turning back, but Peterson wanted to continue just a bit farther, to see if the passage opened into a chamber or dead-ended. At step 412, the staircase ended. The passage terminated at a wall, a solid, flat surface of cut stone. No door, no opening, no continuation, just a wall. The surface was smooth, featureless, except for a single shallow depression near the center, roughly circular, about 6 inches in diameter and 1 inch deep. Peterson examined it closely. It was deliberately carved, not a natural feature. They spent 15 minutes inspecting the wall, tapping on it, listening for hollow spaces. The stone was solid. The passage was a dead end. Peterson took photographs and measurements. The descent had been consistent, 412 steps, at approximately a 32-degree angle. Based on his calculations, they were now roughly 270 feet below the entrance to the original cave, and possibly 500 feet or more below the surface of the hillside above. The team ascended without incident, exiting the cave system at 3:47 p.m. They reported their findings to the ranger station that evening. The ranger on duty, a man named Lucas Grantham, took notes but seemed skeptical. He said the park had no records of artificial structures in the cave systems, and suggested the team might have misinterpreted natural formations. Peterson showed him photographs. Grantham agreed the images were unusual and said he would forward the report to park management. Peterson contacted a geologist at the University of Washington, Dr. Raymond Kowalski, who specialized in karst topography and cave formation. Kowalski reviewed the photographs and survey notes. He confirmed the passage appeared to be artificial, but had no explanation for its origin or purpose. He recommended ground-penetrating radar to determine what, if anything, lay beyond the terminal wall. On October 11th, Peterson's team returned to the site With a portable ground-penetrating radar unit, borrowed from a colleague, they entered the cave at 8:30 a.m. and proceeded to the concealed entrance. The flowstone they had cleared 3 days earlier had not regrown, and the opening was still accessible. But when they tried to enter the passage, they found it blocked. The corridor was filled with sediment, compacted soil, and small stones, packed tightly from floor to ceiling. The obstruction began less than 10 feet from the entrance. Hollings attempted to dig through it with a small folding shovel. The material was dense, almost concrete-like, and extended farther than they could effectively excavate with hand tools. They retreated to the terminal chamber of the original cave and discussed what to do. Vasquez suggested the passage might have collapsed, though that didn't explain the uniformity of the fill or the lack of debris at the entrance. Novikova speculated that someone or something had deliberately filled the passage, though she acknowledged this seemed implausible given the time frame and the remote location. They reported the development to Grantham, who visited the site with a park geologist named Dr. Margaret Brennan on October 13th. Brennan examined the filled passage and collected samples of the sediment. Her preliminary analysis indicated the material was consistent with local soil and rock, but showed signs of compaction beyond what natural settling would produce. She noted in her report, "The passage appears to have been intentionally filled, though the mechanism and timeline are unclear." Kowalski, the geologist from the university, visited the site on October 17th. He attempted to use the ground-penetrating radar to image through the fill, but the density of the material made it difficult to obtain clear readings. He detected what might have been voids or chambers deeper in the hillside, but the data was inconclusive. He recommended excavation using mechanical equipment, but the Park Service declined, citing concerns about damaging the cave system and the logistical challenges of bringing heavy machinery to such a remote location. Peterson submitted a formal request to excavate the passage, proposing a hand excavation project over several weeks. The request was reviewed by park management and denied in November. The official reason given was that the site did not meet criteria for archaeological significance, and excavation posed unacceptable risks to the integrity of the cave system. Peterson appealed the decision. The appeal was denied in January of 2012. He contacted journalists and researchers, hoping to generate interest and pressure the Park Service to reconsider. A few regional news outlets ran brief stories, but the coverage was limited and generated no substantive response. Brennan's sediment analysis was filed in park archives, but never published. Kowalski moved to a position in Oregon in 2013 and did not continue his involvement. In 2014, a different caving group, unaware of Peterson's discovery, obtained a permit to explore the same cave system. They found the concealed entrance behind the flowstone. The passage beyond was still filled. They reported it as a collapsed section and moved on. Peterson visited the site one final time in 2016. The flowstone had begun to regrow over the entrance, and the fill remained. He took a few photographs and left. He has not returned. When asked about the staircase in a 2019 interview, he said, "We found something that shouldn't be there, and then it was taken away or hidden again. I don't know which is more disturbing." And deep beneath the forest and the river, where the limestone holds spaces older than memory, 412 steps descend through stone that was cut by hands and tools unknown. They lead to a wall that stops nothing and separates everything. The passage is filled now, sealed by sediment that arrived too quickly and packed too tightly to be explained by time or collapse. But the stairs remain, buried under earth and silence, waiting at a 32-degree angle for the next person who clears the way and begins counting. Some things refuse to fall, even when the ground beneath them disappears. Kalaloch Beach occupies a remote stretch of the Olympic Peninsula's Pacific coastline, approximately 35 miles south of Forks, Washington. The beach is part of Olympic National Park's coastal strip, a narrow band of protected shoreline characterized by dramatic erosion, towering sea stacks, and dense driftwood accumulations. The area experiences some of the highest rates of coastal erosion in the Pacific Northwest. Storms can remove 10 to 15 feet of bluff face in a single winter season. The beach itself is in constant flux, reshaped by tides, waves, and weather. The region has been home to the Quinault Indian Nation for millennia. Their oral traditions speak of trees that serve as witnesses, standing at thresholds between land and sea, marking places where the boundary between worlds becomes uncertain. Early European settlers in the late 1800s noted the area's instability, reporting cliffs collapsing without warning, and entire sections of forest sliding into the ocean during winter storms. The tree, now known informally as the Witness Tree or Tree Root Cave, sits, or rather hangs, at the southern end of Kalaloch Beach, near Beach 4. It's a Sitka spruce, a species common along the northwest coast, capable of growing over 200 feet tall and living for centuries. This particular tree, however, exists in a state that defies conventional understanding of how trees survive. The earliest confirmed photograph of the tree dates to 1937, taken by a surveyor named Albert Dunbar, who was documenting coastal erosion for the U.S. Geological Survey. In Dunbar's image, archived at the University of Washington, the tree is already in an unusual position. Its root ball is exposed, suspended over the beach, while the trunk extends horizontally, parallel to the eroding bluff. The tree appears alive, needles visible, branches intact. In 1951, a park naturalist named Dorothy Keogh included the tree in a report on coastal vegetation. She noted its improbable persistence and estimated that erosion should have caused it to fall within 5 to 10 years. She photographed it from multiple angles. Comparing her images to Dunbar's, the tree appeared unchanged, same position, same orientation, same degree of root exposure. By 1973, when a photographer named Gerald Tompkins visited the area as part of a National Geographic assignment, the bluff behind the tree had receded significantly. Tompkins measured the distance from the tree's root ball to the bluff face, approximately 32 feet. He noted in his field journal, "The tree should have fallen decades ago. There's no visible means of support. The root structure is completely exposed, suspended in air. Yet it lives." Tompkins returned in 1989 to document changes. The bluff had eroded another 15 feet. The tree remained in the same position. He compared his new photographs to those from 1973. The tree had not moved. The root ball, the trunk, the angle, all identical. He published a short article in a regional environmental magazine, questioning how the tree could persist in such conditions. The article generated modest interest, but no scientific follow-up. In 2001, Dr. Raymond Callahan, a dendrochronologist from Oregon State University, visited Kalaloch Beach with a research team studying old-growth forests in the Olympic coastal zone. They were aware of the tree's reputation and decided to investigate. On July 12th, Callahan and two assistants, Marcus Feinberg and Leah Sorensen, approached the tree with coring equipment. Taking core samples from a living tree in a national park required a permit, which Callahan had obtained. The team carefully extracted a pencil-thin core from the trunk, approximately 18 inches from the base. The process was minimally invasive, and the hole would seal naturally over time. They extracted the core successfully and preserved it for laboratory analysis. Back at Oregon State, Callahan analyzed the core under magnification. Tree rings' annual growth layers provide a chronological record of a tree's life. With each ring representing 1 year, Callahan counted the rings from the outermost layer inward. The tree was old, born around 1823, based on ring count. But something was wrong. The outermost rings, those representing the most recent decades, were barely distinguishable. In healthy trees, rings vary in width based on environmental conditions, but they remain distinct. This tree's rings became increasingly compressed toward the outer edge, and after a certain point, they stopped entirely. The last clearly defined ring corresponded to 1954. After that, no discernible growth. Callahan repeated the analysis. Same result. He consulted with colleagues. They suggested the tree might be in a state of suspended growth, alive but not actively producing new wood, a phenomenon observed in extremely stressed or dying trees. But such trees typically show visible signs of decline: dead branches, needle loss, bark damage. The witness tree showed none of these. Photographs from 2001 depicted a tree in apparent health. Callahan published his findings in a forestry journal in 2002. The paper, titled Anomalous Growth Cessation in a Coastal Sitka Spruce, presented the data without speculation. Reviewers noted the findings were unusual but not unprecedented. One suggested the tree might be drawing nutrients through a hidden connection to the bluff, though how this would work with fully exposed roots was unclear. In 2007, a geologist named Dr. Sandra Kurosawa conducted a coastal erosion study in the Kalaloch area. She documented the bluff recession rates and projected future changes. Her report included a section on the witness tree, noting that based on erosion patterns, the bluff face should have passed the tree's current position decades earlier. She wrote, "The tree's persistence contradicts expected erosion timelines. Either our models are incorrect, or the tree is an outlier that warrants further investigation." Kurosawa's report prompted the Park Service to commission a structural assessment. In March of 2008, an engineering team visited the site to determine if the tree posed a safety risk to beachgoers. The lead engineer, Thomas Whitfield, examined the root structure and conducted measurements. His report stated, "The tree is structurally unsound by conventional standards. The root ball lacks sufficient anchoring to withstand wind loads or seismic activity. However, no signs of imminent failure are present. Recommend continued monitoring." Over the next decade, the tree became a minor tourist attraction. Visitors photographed it, marveled at its improbable position, and speculated about how it remained standing. Park rangers fielded questions, but had no official explanation. Some described it as a quirk of geology, perhaps a deep taproot or a subterranean ledge providing hidden support. But no one had verified this, and excavation was not permitted in the park. In 2017, a photographer named Julia Mendez spent a week at Kalaloch Beach, documenting the tree at different times of day and in various weather conditions. She compared her images to historical photographs dating back to Dunbar's 1937 survey. Using digital overlay techniques, she aligned the images. The tree's position had not changed, not by an inch. For 80 years, it had remained frozen in the same orientation, the same angle, the same impossible suspension over the eroding beach. Mendez published her findings in a photography blog, accompanied by a time-lapse animation created from the historical images. The post went viral in certain online communities interested in anomalies and unexplained phenomena. It attracted attention from researchers and skeptics alike. Some suggested photographic manipulation or misidentification, that different trees were being compared across decades. But the distinctive shape of the root ball and the specific configuration of the trunk made misidentification unlikely. In 2019, Dr. Callahan returned to the tree with a new research team. He wanted to take additional core samples and conduct ground-penetrating radar scans to search for hidden root connections. The Park Service denied his permit request. The official reason cited was concern about cumulative damage to the tree from repeated sampling and the potential disturbance to an ecologically sensitive area. Callahan appealed. The appeal was denied in 2020. Frustrated, Callahan shared his experience with a journalist named Rebecca Ashford, who was writing a feature on unexplained natural phenomena in the Pacific Northwest. Ashford visited Kalaloch in August of 2020 and interviewed park staff. A ranger named Vincent Larkin told her off the record, "We don't really talk about that tree much anymore. People ask, and we just say it's an interesting example of coastal erosion, but honestly, none of us understand it. And I think the park prefers it that way. Ashford's article was published in a regional magazine in October of 2020. It included interviews with Callahan, Kurosawa, and Mendes, and presented the tree as a genuine mystery, something that exists in a state that shouldn't be possible, but undeniably is. The article generated renewed interest, but the Park Service issued no new statements, and at Kalaloch Beach, where the cliffs crumble and the ocean takes everything back, the tree remains, roots exposed, trunk horizontal, suspended over sand and stone, alive in photographs from nearly a century ago, alive today, growing nothing since 1954, but refusing to die, holding its position while the world erodes around it, a witness to time that stopped counting rings, but never stopped watching. The bluff recedes, the storms come, the tree does not fall, and no one can explain why. Sometimes, distance becomes a circle you can't escape by walking forward. The Bogachiel River Trail follows the Bogachiel River Valley through the western interior of Olympic National Park, cutting through one of the most isolated sections of temperate rainforest in the continental United States. The trail extends roughly 8 miles into the backcountry, gaining minimal elevation but traversing difficult terrain, muddy sections, fallen trees, dense undergrowth. Annual rainfall in the valley exceeds 140 inches, creating an environment where moss covers every surface and visibility rarely extends beyond 30 feet. The trail is lightly used, particularly in winter and early spring when conditions are wettest. The area has been home to the Quileute tribe for thousands of years. Their oral traditions describe certain sections of the forest as places where direction becomes unreliable, where travelers can walk for hours without making progress, and where the land itself resists being crossed. Early European explorers in the late 1800s reported similar disorientation, noting that compasses behaved erratically and familiar landmarks seemed to shift position. On March 7, 2015, two experienced backpackers, Olivia Hardwick, a wildlife biologist from Seattle, and David Tanaka, a software engineer from Portland, set out to hike the Bogachiel River Trail. Both were in their early 30s, physically fit and familiar with backcountry navigation. They planned a 2-day trip, camping at one of the designated sites roughly 6 miles in. The weather forecast called for light rain, typical for the season. They entered the trail at 9:37 a.m. The conditions were as expected: overcast, drizzling, muddy underfoot. Visibility was reduced by fog and dense vegetation, but the trail was well marked with cairns and occasional signage. Hardwick carried a handheld GPS unit, a standard practice for her fieldwork. Tanaka had a smartphone with offline maps and a backup compass. Both wore fitness trackers that recorded steps and distance. At approximately 11:15 a.m., they reached a section of the trail, about 3.4 miles from the trailhead. The area was unremarkable tall Sitka spruce and western hemlock, thick undergrowth of ferns and salal, a relatively flat stretch with the river audible but not visible through the trees. Hardwick checked the GPS out of habit. The coordinates read 47.86 degrees north, 124.33 degrees west. They continued hiking. 7 minutes later, at 11:22 a.m., Hardwick checked the GPS again. Same coordinates. Exactly the same. She assumed the unit had frozen or lost satellite signal, common in dense forest. She turned it off and back on. The unit reacquired satellites. 5 bars, strong signal. The coordinates remained unchanged. Tanaka suggested they keep moving and check again in a few minutes. They walked steadily, maintaining their usual pace of roughly 2 miles per hour. The trail was straight in this section, no switchbacks or curves. At 11:29 a.m., Hardwick checked the GPS. Same coordinates, 47.86 north, 124.33 west. They stopped. Hardwick examined the GPS unit closely, cycling through different screens. The unit was functioning normally, showing altitude, speed, time, satellite count, but the position remained fixed. Tanaka checked his phone. His GPS app showed the same coordinates. He refreshed the app. No change. Concerned they might be experiencing equipment failure, they decided to use the compass. Tanaka pulled out his backup, a liquid-filled baseplate compass, reliable and mechanical. They oriented themselves, confirmed they were heading east along the trail as expected, and continued walking. At 11:36 a.m., Hardwick checked the GPS. Same coordinates. At this point, Hardwick began to feel uneasy. She later described it in her written account. It wasn't panic, but a growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. We were moving. We could feel ourselves walking, covering ground. But according to the GPS, we hadn't gone anywhere. They walked for another 7 minutes. At 11:43 a.m., the GPS showed the same position. Tanaka checked his fitness tracker. It showed he had taken over 1,600 steps since 11:15 a.m., roughly equivalent to 3/4 of a mile. But the GPS insisted they were still at the original coordinates. Hardwick suggested they mark their position physically. She pulled a roll of bright orange flagging tape from her pack and tied a strip around a tree at eye level. They continued hiking, watching for the flagged tree. 7 minutes later, at 11:50 a.m., they had not seen it, but the GPS still showed the same coordinates. The forest around them looked identical, same dense vegetation, same tree species, same flat terrain. There were no distinguishing landmarks, no way to verify whether they were passing the same point repeatedly or moving through a uniform stretch of forest. Tanaka tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal, expected this deep in the park. At 11:57 a.m., 41 minutes after the loop began, the GPS coordinates suddenly changed. The unit showed they had moved roughly 0.3 miles east along the trail. Tanaka's phone confirmed the new position. They stopped and looked around. The forest appeared no different. They retraced their steps, looking for the orange flagging tape. They never found it. When they checked their fitness trackers later, both devices showed they had walked approximately 3.2 miles during the 41-minute period, a pace consistent with their normal hiking speed. But neither of them remembered the details of that time. Hardwick described it as a blur, like driving a familiar route and arriving without remembering the journey. Tanaka said he remembered walking and checking the GPS, but the intervening moments felt compressed, incomplete. They continued to their planned campsite, without further incident, and spent an uneventful night. The following day, they hiked out and reported the experience to the ranger station. The ranger on duty, a woman named Carmen Velasquez, took their account but seemed uncertain how to classify it. She filed a brief report noting GPS anomaly and possible navigational disorientation, and suggested the hikers may have experienced a temporary equipment malfunction. Hardwick contacted the GPS manufacturer, Garmin, and described the incident. A technical support representative reviewed the data log from her unit. The log showed that between 11:15 and 11:57 a.m., the GPS had recorded the same coordinates, repeatedly updating every few seconds, as normal, but showing no position change. Then, at 11:57, the position jumped 0.3 miles east. The representative had no explanation for this behavior and suggested it might be a satellite geometry issue or multipath error, though he acknowledged that neither fully explained the sustained identical readings. Tanaka examined his phone's GPS log. It showed the same pattern, fixed coordinates for 41 minutes. Then a sudden jump. His fitness tracker, which used a combination of accelerometer data and GPS, showed continuous motion throughout the period. The data suggested he had been walking steadily, covering distance, but his GPS location hadn't changed until the 41-minute mark. In April of 2015, a physicist at the University of Washington named Dr. Margaret Sorensen reviewed the GPS logs at Hardwick's request. Sorensen specialized in satellite navigation systems and had worked with GPS anomalies in other contexts. She confirmed the logs were genuine and unaltered, but could offer no satisfactory explanation. If the GPS units were malfunctioning, I'd expect noise or dropped signals, not stable, repeated readings of the same position, she said in an email. And for two independent devices to show the same behavior simultaneously suggests an environmental factor, though I can't identify what that would be. Sorensen recommended Hardwick contact the National Geodetic Survey, or NOAA, to report the anomaly. But both agencies indicated that isolated GPS irregularities in remote areas were not uncommon and typically attributed to atmospheric conditions or terrain effects. No formal investigation was conducted. In June, Hardwick and Tanaka returned to the Bogachil River Trail to attempt to replicate the experience. They hiked to the approximate location where the loop had occurred, using the coordinates from their GPS logs. They spent several hours in the area, walking back and forth, monitoring their GPS units. Everything functioned normally. No loops, no fixed coordinates. They found no physical features that might explain the original incident. A park naturalist named Douglas Pemberton, who had worked in the area for over a decade, mentioned to Hardwick during a casual conversation that other hikers had reported similar experiences, losing time or feeling disoriented on the Bogachil Trail, but most attributed it to fatigue or the monotony of the dense forest. No formal reports had been filed. Pemberton himself had never experienced anything unusual, but noted, "The forest does strange things to people. You're surrounded by green. Everything looks the same, and your sense of distance gets warped. It's easy to lose track." But Hardwick and Tanaka's experience involved more than subjective disorientation. Their devices had recorded objective data, GPS logs, step counts, timestamps. The data told a story. They had walked 3.2 miles in 41 minutes, but remained at the same geographic coordinates for that entire duration, returning to the same point every 7 minutes before finally breaking free. And somewhere along the Bogachil River Trail, in a stretch of forest indistinguishable from any other, a loop may still exist. A 7-minute circle that traps distance inside itself, where forward motion becomes repetition and GPS satellites see nothing but the same coordinates, over and over, while pedometers count steps that lead nowhere except back to the beginning. The flagging tape was never found. The memory of walking remains incomplete. And 3.2 miles were traveled in a space that held them in place for 41 minutes, then let them go without explanation. Not all weather stations report on the sky. The Queets River Valley occupies the southwestern corner of Olympic National Park, a remote drainage basin surrounded by steep, forested ridges that rise over 4,000 feet. The valley receives more than 12 feet of rain annually, supporting one of the densest temperate rainforests in North America. The river itself is glacially fed, originating high in the Olympic Mountains and flowing roughly 40 miles to the Pacific Ocean. Access is limited, no paved roads penetrate the interior, and the few trails that exist are poorly maintained and frequently washed out by flooding. The area has been significant to the Quinault Indian Nation for thousands of years. Their oral histories describe the Upper Valley as a place where observation is dangerous, where certain things should not be counted or named. During the Cold War, the Olympic Peninsula became a site of interest for various federal agencies, due to its proximity to naval installations and its isolated geography. Weather monitoring stations were established throughout the region, some official, others less documented. On November 18, 1963, a routine weather summary compiled by the National Weather Service office in Seattle included data from multiple monitoring stations across western Washington. Most entries were standard: temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, precipitation. But one entry stood out. It was attributed to Station W, Queets Valley, and included the following observations: temperature, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, barometric pressure, 29.87 inches, wind, calm, visibility, absolute, shadow count, 5, ascending. The report was filed and processed without immediate scrutiny. Weather summaries often contained hundreds of data points, and anomalies were typically flagged only if they affected forecasts. But 3 weeks later, on December 9th, a meteorologist named Dr. Helen Pembroke at the University of Washington noticed the entry while reviewing archived data for a research project on precipitation patterns. Two phrases troubled her: visibility absolute and shadow count, 5, ascending. Visibility absolute was not standard meteorological terminology. Visibility is measured in miles or meters, not described in absolute terms. And shadow count had no meaning in weather observation. Pembroke contacted the National Weather Service to inquire about Station W. She was told no such station existed in their records. She provided the November 18th report as evidence. The Seattle office reviewed their files and confirmed the entry was present, but could not explain its origin. Pembroke pursued the matter further. She obtained a copy of the full weather summary from November 18th and examined the metadata. Station W was listed alongside legitimate stations Quileute, Hoquiam, Olympia, but with no identifier code, no coordinates, and no contact information. The report appeared to have been transmitted via teletype, the standard method for weather data in the early 1960s, but the originating station could not be traced. In January of 1964, Pembroke contacted Olympic National Park to ask if they had any knowledge of weather monitoring stations in the Queets Valley. A ranger named Douglas Merrick responded, stating that the park maintained several rain gauges and basic weather equipment at various locations, but none were designated Station W, and none were staffed by meteorologists. He offered to check historical records and follow up. Merrick found a reference in a 1961 park maintenance log to a federal weather installation, Upper Queets, coordinates unavailable. No further details were provided. He also discovered a requisition from 1962 for supplies, batteries, radio equipment, and weatherproofing materials to be delivered to Station W, Queets River Drainage. The requisition had been fulfilled, but no receiving signature or follow-up documentation existed. Merrick organized a search of the Upper Queets Valley. In March of 1964, he led a team of 3 rangers, Vincent Caldwell, Patricia Ruiz, and Samuel Kowalski, on a multi-day expedition to locate any remnants of the station. They hiked approximately 12 miles into the valley, searching areas accessible by foot and using topographic maps to identify potential sites for a weather installation. They found nothing: no structures, no concrete pads, no cleared areas, no equipment. The forest was undisturbed, old-growth trees, thick undergrowth, no signs of recent human activity. Merrick documented the search in a report filed with park headquarters, noting, "No evidence of Station W found. Area consistent with untouched wilderness. If a structure existed, it has been removed or was never present." Pembroke was not satisfied. She requested records from the National Weather Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Department of Defense, asking for any documentation related to Station W or weather monitoring in the Queets Valley during the early 1960s. Most agencies responded with standard letters stating no records matched her inquiry. The Department of Defense did not respond at all. In April of 1964, Pembroke contacted the meteorologist listed on the November 18th report. A name typed at the bottom of the entry, Observer T. Harlan. She searched professional directories, university affiliations, and Weather Service employment records. No meteorologist by that name existed. She expanded her search to include anyone named T. Harlan working in any federal capacity in Washington state. No matches. She attempted to trace the teletype transmission. Weather data in the early 1960s was transmitted over dedicated communication lines, and logs of transmissions were typically maintained. The Seattle Weather Service office told her that logs from 1963 had been archived, but were no longer easily accessible. They offered to search if she could provide funding or official justification. She could not. Pembroke's inquiries attracted the attention of a journalist named Raymond Stiles, who worked for a small regional newspaper in Aberdeen. Stiles contacted her in May and asked if he could write a feature about the mystery. Pembroke agreed, hoping publicity might uncover new information. Stiles interviewed her, reviewed the documents she had collected, and reached out to the National Weather Service and Olympic National Park for comments. Both declined to provide statements beyond confirming the basic facts. An entry existed, no station was on record, and no physical evidence had been found. Stiles' article was published on June 7, 1964, under the headline, "The Weather Station That Wasn't There." It presented the available facts without speculation and invited readers to come forward with information. 2 people responded. One was a former park employee who recalled hearing rumors in the early 1960s about government people working in the backcountry, but had no direct knowledge. The other was a local hiker who claimed to have seen a small concrete structure near the Queets River in 1962, but could not remember the exact location and had not thought much of it at the time. Stiles attempted to follow up with the hiker, a man named Gordon Alvarez, but Alvarez was vague and eventually stopped responding to inquiries. Stiles visited the Queets Valley himself in July, hiking several miles upriver with a camera and notebook. He found no evidence of a structure. His follow-up article, published in August, concluded that the mystery remained unsolved and was likely the result of a clerical error or misattribution. Pembroke continued to investigate sporadically over the next few years, but made no progress. In 1967, she submitted a paper to a meteorology journal, documenting the incident and raising questions about data integrity in weather reporting. The paper was rejected with a note that it was insufficiently rigorous and overly speculative. She never published her findings. The November 18, 1963, weather summary remains in the National Weather Service archives. The entry for Station W is still present, unchanged. In 1989, a researcher named Dr. Marcus Tanaka came across Pembroke's notes while conducting historical research on Pacific Northwest weather data. He contacted the National Weather Service to inquire about Station W. He was told the entry was likely a data entry error and should be disregarded. He asked for clarification on what visibility absolute and shadow count 5 ascending might mean. No one could provide an answer. Tanaka visited Olympic National Park in 1990 and hiked into the Queets Valley. He searched areas identified in Merrick's 1964 report. He found nothing. He interviewed Merrick, who was retired but still living in Port Angeles. Merrick remembered the search clearly and maintained that no structure had been present. If there was ever something there, Merrick said, it was gone before we arrived, or it was never there to begin with. In 2008, a historian named Laura Finch was researching Cold War-era weather monitoring programs for a book on environmental surveillance. She found references to classified weather stations operated by the Department of Defense in the 1960s, some of which were never publicly documented. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests for records related to Olympic National Park. Most requests were denied or returned heavily redacted. One document, partially declassified in 2009, mentioned atmospheric observation programs in the Olympic region but provided no specifics. Finch contacted Tanaka, who shared his research. Together, they attempted to locate T. Harlan through military and federal employment records. No results. They searched for anyone named Harlan who worked in meteorology, atmospheric science, or related fields during the 1960s. They found 3 candidates, but ruled them all out. None had connections to Washington State or Olympic National Park. And somewhere in the archives, in a weather summary from November 18, 1963, an entry remains. Station W, temperature, pressure, wind, visibility, absolute. Shadow count, 5, ascending. Observations signed by a person who never existed. Transmitted from a place that cannot be found, describing phenomena that have no definition. The Queets River still flows through the forest. The rain still falls. And if there are still things being counted in the valley shadows, or otherwise no one has reported them, or perhaps no one is left to send the transmission. Some processions are witnessed, but never joined. Shi Beach stretches along the northwestern coast of the Olympic Peninsula, accessible only by a rugged 2-mile trail through dense forest that descends to a wild, windswept shoreline. The beach is part of Olympic National Park's coastal strip, a remote area that sees fewer visitors than more accessible sections of the park. The coastline here is dramatic. Massive sea stacks rise from the surf. Driftwood logs form barriers 20 feet high, and the beach extends for miles, with no structures or development visible in any direction. The Makah tribe has inhabited this coastline for thousands of years. Their oral traditions describe the beach as a threshold place, where the ocean brings things that do not belong to the land, and where certain hours of the day hold significance. The blue hour, the period of twilight before sunrise, when the world is suspended between darkness and light, is considered a time when boundaries weaken. Early European settlers and Coast Guard personnel stationed nearby in the early 20th century noted the area's isolation and the disorienting effect of fog, which could roll in without warning and persist for days. The first documented report of the procession came in July of 1972. A couple from Seattle, Richard and Donna Barstow, were camping at Shi Beach during a week-long backpacking trip along the Olympic coast. On the morning of July 23rd, Richard woke before dawn and walked down to the water's edge. The sky was beginning to lighten the blue hour, that brief window when the sun has not yet risen but the horizon glows with diffuse light. He saw figures walking along the tide line, a line of them, single file, moving from north to south. He estimated 40 individuals, though counting was difficult in the low light. They were silhouettes, dark shapes against the gray sand and darker water. They walked steadily, not hurrying, maintaining even spacing between one another. Richard assumed they were other campers, or possibly a group on an organized hike. He watched for several minutes, then returned to the tent to wake Donna. By the time they both reached the water's edge, perhaps 5 minutes later, the sun was cresting the horizon. The figures were gone. The beach was empty. Richard walked south along the tide line, looking for footprints or any sign of the group. The sand showed tracks from his own feet, but nothing else. The tide was low, and the beach was firm and wet, ideal for preserving prints. There were none. The Barstows mentioned the incident to other campers they encountered later that day. One man, a solo hiker named Martin Kelleher, said he had seen something similar the previous morning. Figures walking the beach before sunrise, gone by the time the sun fully appeared. He had assumed his eyes were playing tricks in the dim light. No formal report was filed at the time. The Barstows returned home and did not think much about the experience until the following summer, when they saw a brief mention in a hiking newsletter about unusual sightings at Shi Beach. They contacted the newsletter editor, who connected them with a park ranger named Douglas Trent. Trent interviewed them in August of 1973 and took detailed notes. Trent was skeptical but thorough. He contacted Kelleher, who confirmed his account and provided a written statement. Trent also spoke with a local fisherman named Victor Alvarez, who worked the waters near Shi. Alvarez said he had seen the procession twice, once in May of 1972 and again in June of 1973. Both times, he had been returning to shore just before dawn. He described it as a line of people, maybe 40 or so, walking the beach. They looked real enough, but when the sun came up, they were gone. No boats, no tracks, nothing. Trent filed a report with park headquarters in September of 1973, noting multiple consistent sightings and recommending further observation. The report was acknowledged, but no action was taken. Trent continued to monitor the area, visiting Shishi Beach several times over the next year and interviewing additional witnesses. In October of 1973, a biology student named Sarah Kowalski was conducting a solo research project on tide pool ecosystems. She camped at Shishi for 5 nights. On the morning of October 14th, she woke at 5:30 a.m. to photograph the beach at first light. While setting up her camera, she saw the procession. She immediately began taking photographs. The light was low, requiring long exposures, but she managed several shots before the figures vanished at sunrise. When the film was developed, the images showed the beach, the sea stacks, the driftwood, but no figures. The exposures were correct, the focus sharp, but the procession did not appear. Kowalski reviewed her negatives multiple times. Nothing. She wrote to Trent, describing what she had seen and the photographic failure. Trent visited her in November and reviewed her notes and camera equipment. He found no technical explanation for why the figures had not been captured on film. By 1974, word of the sightings had spread among regular visitors to the Olympic coast. Some people came specifically hoping to witness the procession. Reports became more frequent. A group of 3 hikers in April, a solo camper in June, a family in August. All described the same phenomenon: a line of approximately 40 figures, walking single file along the tide line during the blue hour, disappearing at sunrise, leaving no footprints. In November of 1974, the U.S. Coast Guard was contacted. A Coast Guard investigator named Lieutenant Raymond Holloway visited Shishi Beach and interviewed witnesses. He filed a report in December recommending a search of the nearshore waters for possible wreckage or submerged objects that might explain the sightings. The search was conducted in January of 1975 using sonar and divers. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no submerged debris, no anomalies. Holloway's report concluded, "Witnesses appear credible and describe consistent observations. No physical evidence supports the presence of individuals on the beach during reported times. No wreckage or remains located in adjacent waters. Phenomenon remains unexplained." The sightings continued. In 1978, a journalist named Rebecca Ashford spent a week at Shishi Beach attempting to document the procession. She saw it twice. Both times it appeared during the blue hour and vanished at sunrise. She tried audio recording, video recording, and still photography. None captured the figures. Her article, published in a regional magazine in 1979, described the experience as profoundly unsettling, not because of what was seen, but because of what couldn't be documented. In 1986, a geologist named Dr. Marcus Finch visited the area while researching coastal erosion. He witnessed the procession on September 3rd. He later wrote, "I am trained to observe and analyze. I saw a line of figures walking the beach. They were dark, indistinct, but clearly humanoid. They moved with purpose. At sunrise, they were no longer visible. I searched for tracks. There were none. I have no explanation." By the 1990s, the phenomenon had become known among certain communities, coastal hikers, paranormal researchers, and locals. The Park Service received occasional inquiries, but provided no official comment beyond acknowledging that unusual sightings have been reported. In 1991, the Coast Guard conducted a second investigation, following renewed interest. The conclusion was identical to the 1975 report. No physical evidence, no explanation. Trent, the original ranger who documented the sightings, retired in 1995. In a 2003 interview, he said, "I saw it myself, twice. I don't know what it is. People have been seeing it for decades. It happens during the blue hour, always the same, a line of about 40, walking south. gone at sunrise. No tracks. No bodies ever found. No wreckage. It's a procession of something, but I can't tell you what. In 2007, a photographer named Daniel Vargas spent 3 weeks at Shishi Beach with high-sensitivity cameras and infrared equipment. He witnessed the procession 4 times. His equipment recorded nothing. He described it in his project notes. The human eye sees them. The camera does not. This suggests either a perceptual phenomenon or something that technology cannot capture. I lean toward the latter, though I can't explain why. The most recent confirmed sighting was in August of 2019, reported by a hiker named Olivia Mercado. She saw the procession on August 12th. She did not attempt to photograph it. She had read about the photographic failures, but she watched it from start to finish. She counted 38 figures, though she acknowledged the count might be inexact. She noted they moved at a steady pace, never deviating from the tide line, and vanished the moment the sun broke the horizon. And every morning at Shishi Beach, the blue hour arrives. The light changes from black to gray to pale blue. The ocean continues its rhythm. And somewhere along the tide line, perhaps still, a line of 40 walks in silence, not ghosts, not memories, something else. Something that appears when the world is suspended between night and day, when the eye can see but the camera cannot, when footprints should form but don't. A procession that has no beginning, no end, and no explanation. Only witnesses who watch from the driftwood and sand, knowing that at sunrise the line will vanish and the beach will be empty again.